Hi, welcome to True Crime and Coke. I am your host, Eve, and this podcast is about true crime and anything strange or unusual. I drink lots of Diet Coke, mispronounce most names, places, and words wrong. If you aren't watching this on my YouTube page, check it out. Some episodes have pictures to go with the story. If I have anything else to bring up, I will add it to the end of the episode so you can choose to listen to it or not. You're welcome. All links will be in the show notes. So, let's get started. So part 3 is going to be the confession with more details of the murders. I already went through a summary of it on episode 2, and this will go into detailed information. One thing they also learned is that on the day that Berdella was caught, when the police saw him arriving home, that Berdella knew that the cops were there. He willingly went home because a neighbor had called him and told him that cops were at his house. So when he went home, he knew he was going to be arrested. So it wasn't a surprise. He was actually pretty much turning himself in. That surprised the investigators because they didn't think that. So when I am reading where I have to ask the question and then answer as Berdella, it is always Prosecutor Hall that is asking Berdella questions. This was determined before this confession started. If any of the other investigators had a question to ask, they would write it down and hand it to Prosecutor Hall, and then he would ask. So anytime I am reading in a question-answer format, it is always Prosecutor Hall asking and Robert Berdella answering. So Prosecutor Hall directed Berdella to start from the beginning of the crimes, starting with Jerry Howe. Berdella told of meeting Jerry through his father at the flea market, of seeing him hustling at 10th and McGee, of trying to help him when he had some trouble with the law. Berdella occasionally supplied Howell with Valium or marijuana, saying he got the Valium through a prescription he had with his doctor. Hall then asked, "Were you also procuring drugs from a veterinarian for your dogs?" "Yes," Berdella said, "in addition to vitamins, vaccines, and calcium pills." Berdella also obtained the animal tranquilizers acepromazine and chlorpromazine and the anesthetic ketamine. Berdella bought the tranquilizers from a veterinarian supply shop, and they did not need a prescription, and those were chlorpromazine and Thorazine. Berdella never injected Howell with any of the chemicals up until July. So, Berdella met with Jerry Howe on July 5th, 1984. Berdella said he was already angry with Freddie Kellogg and Foster Simmons because he had helped them out repeatedly and they made no effort to repay him. Berdella mentioned the Camaro he repossessed from Kellogg and that it was stashed in Parkville, Missouri, northwest of Kansas City. The car wasn't running, and Berdella said Howe had agreed to go with him to Parkville that evening to look it over. When I picked him up, he announced that he didn't have time to go look at the car, that he wanted to get to this dance contest about 7. Berdella said that he wanted to get to this dance contest at about 7, but he wanted to party between that before I took him to the dance. And he started asking for drugs. At that point, I just started giving them to him. I had some Valium in the car and some acepromazine tablets. We got a 6-pack of Coors, and then we got over to my house, and he still wanted to get more drugged. At that point, I misrepresented what a couple of pills were and gave him enough medication for him to pass out. Berdella felt that Howe owed him for the favors Berdella had done. This was not the first time that Jerry would agree to do something to start repaying this and then just blow it off, Berdella commented. Prosecutor Hall directed Berdella to start from the beginning of the crimes. With Jerry Howell, Berdella told of meeting Jerry through his father at the flea market, of seeing him hustling at 10th and McGee, of trying to help him when he had some trouble with the law. Berdella occasionally supplied Howell with Valium or marijuana, saying he got the Valium through a prescription he had with his doctor. Prosecutor Hall then asked, "Were you also procuring drugs from a veterinarian for your dogs?" "Yes," Berdella said, "in addition to vitamins, vaccine, and calcium pills." Berdella also obtained the animal tranquilizers acepromazine and chlorpromazine and the anesthetic ketamine. Hall wondered if Berdella got the tranquilizers from a veterinarian, too. No, Berdella said. A veterinarian supply shop. He said no prescription was required for any of the drugs, including chlorpromazine, a form of thorazine that is a very strong tranquilizer. But you're telling us, Hall said, that you never at any time up until July injected any of these chemicals into Jerry Howe. That's correct. Hall and Berdella agreed that Berdella met with Jerry Howe on July 5, 1984. Berdella said he was already angry with Freddie Kellogg and Foster Simmons because he had helped them out repeatedly, and they made no effort to repay him. Berdella mentioned the Camaro he repossessed from Kellogg and that it was stashed in Parkville, Missouri, northwest of Kansas City. The car wasn't running, and Berdella said Howe had agreed to go with him to Parkville that evening to look it over. When I picked him up, he announced that he didn't have time to go look at the car, that he wanted to get to this dance contest at about 7, Berdella said. But he wanted to party between that before I took him to the dance. And he started asking for drugs. And at that point, I just started giving them to him. I had some Valium in the car and some ace-promazine tablets. We got a 6-pack of Coors, and then we got over to my house, and he still wanted to get more drugged. At that point, I misrepresented what a couple of pills were and gave him enough medication for him to pass out. Berdella felt that Howe owed him for the favors Berdella had done. This was not the first time that Jerry would agree to do something to start repaying this and then just blow it off, Berdella commented. Hall said, "So when he made this announcement that he didn't want to go up to Parkville, what did you do?" "Externally, I kept my cool," Berdella recalled. "Internally, I lost it. I became very upset, and I think from the time we got to the house on that I wasn't working in a particularly rational state of mind." Hall handed Berdella 2 sheets of paper with handwriting on them and asked him to identify the papers. "These are the notes that I took of Jerry Howe on the date of July 5th, 1984, and it continues until July 6th, 1984. Hall asked, "The notes consist of dates and times and certain activity on those dates and times?" "That's correct," Berdella said, "and it shows here that Jerry Howe passed out at 6:40. "Okay," Hall said. "What was your purpose in making this, and we'll call it a diary from this point on, the Howe diary?" Berdella answered, "Kind of, I guess, compulsive behavior. I've always been a note-taker. An example is when my dogs had pups, I would weigh them at birth and keep a record of the sexes, colors, growth development over the first week or 2. Hall said, "Other than your pups, prior to July 5th of 84, have you ever made a diary regarding your activity with another human being?" "Yes," Berdella said. He said that he had kept notes on several people whom he had also photographed to record the effects of the drugs they had injected and whether he had sex with them after that. The people named were all alive, and Berdella said he hadn't sodomized any of them. Hall brought Berdella back to the Howe diary. Howe passed out in Berdella's bed after ingesting one tablet after another. Looking at a photocopy of the diary, Hall asked Berdella about the entry at 7. 1 cc pH arm. Berdella said pH stood for a tranquilizer one of Howe's friends had given him, a heavy tranquilizer that he and his friends didn't like because it was too strong. Hall asked, "Had you ever shot anybody up with it before?" "No." 1 cc, I take it, indicates that you did inject it into him, Hall said. "That's right." "And into his arm?" "Right." "And prior to that," Hall said, "you had never injected any drugs into Mr. Howell?" "That's correct." "And Mr. Howell told you that he did not take drugs intravenously?" "That's correct." "At 7, when you injected the drug into him, he was unconscious at that time?" Hall asked. "Yes." "What was your purpose then in injecting him again, injecting him at 7? Hall asked. "Initially, I think I just wanted to tranquilize him enough to have sex." Somewhere along between, I would say, 7 and 8 is where I started doing things for motives at the time that I don't think were clear to me. I just wanted to initially have him helpless, and from helpless to, I guess, under my control. See, the thing is, Berdella and Hal had had consensual sex before, so Hal asked, "Why did you feel it was necessary at this time to inject him so you could have sex?" I don't think it was injecting so I could have sex. At this point, I think I was functioning on a level of, he's backed out again. I'm really mad at him. I'm going to be in control of him. And I drugged him and then tied him up so I could control him. This is the first time I had done anything like this. To anyone? Hall asked. To anyone. And when you did it on this particular occasion, you were mad at Howell? Among other people, he became the culmination of a long frustration. And I take it that you found it to be pleasurable to bind him and inject him, Hall asked. Perhaps not pleasurable, but satisfied a need or an emotion that I had at the time. Going down the first page of the diary, Berdella said that he injected Hal again at 7:25, then with 2 cc's of chlorpromazine at 7:30, 3 cc's of chlorpromazine at 7:55, and then 11 more cc's of chlorpromazine, this time injected into the buttocks at 8. Each injection was noted in the diary. Up to this point, had you attempted to have sex with him? Hall asked. I think sex was one of the goals, Berdella said, but I was functioning more on a level of, I don't care anymore. I just wanted to have control over the situation. Hall asked, and was that, I'm trying to understand what was going on in your mind at the time. Was that in order to dominate him, or in order to hurt him, to kill him, or a combination? There was no intent to hurt him, Berdella said, torture, or anything like that. My motivation was mainly to have control over the situation and to have sex in a situation where I'd be in complete control. At the 8:40 entry, after another 11 cc's of injections, the number 29 was circled. Berdella explained that this was the cumulative total of cc's he'd injected into Howell so far. At 8:45, Berdella wrote tied. That meant Howell's hands and legs were tied to the bed. Where before he had been at least moving involuntarily, now Hal was completely unconscious. 9 and 10 both have the entry F, Hall said, which would be the abbreviation that I used for fuck. Would that have been anal intercourse then? Hall asked. Yes. Hall moved down to the notation at 11:30 that indicated Hal was vomiting. At that point in time, Hall said, "Did you realize that Mr. Hal was having difficulties and that, in fact, by vomiting, he could die?" "Probably, yes," Berdella said. "I don't remember a clear recollection of that, but at this point I guess I was functioning on automatic pilot. I was just going through events as they came." Hall said, "And you certainly knew what the events were because you were recording them at the time." "That's correct." "You also have a notation, eyes blank," Hall said. "What does that mean?" "I checked his eyes, and the pupils would have been in a pinpoint state with no response to light movement." 11:45, BF, Hall said, continuing down the page, which would be buttfuck. "Another anal sodomy." "Right." "Is that snoring?" Hall asked, pointing to the next word in the 11:45 entry. "Yes." "What do you mean by that?" "He was snoring," Berdella said. "After the sex, he started snoring." "Still tied at this time?" Hall asked. "He was kept tied the entire time." 12:30, BF again, Hall noted. "Anal sodomy?" "Right." Berdella continued making notations through the night, noting Hal's appearance, his reactions, and also the amounts of the injections, which continued as well as did the sodomization. According to Berdella's log, he sodomized Hal at 1:30 a.m., 2:30, 4:30, and 6:30, writing BF each time. Berdella pointed out that he would wash Hal's eyes and mouth periodically, then replace the gag he had tied around his captive's head. Between the sexual assaults, Berdella lay next to Hal, either sleeping or resting. At about 8:15 a.m. the morning of July 6th, Berdella noticed that Hal seemed to be rousing from his temporary coma. Berdella remedied that promptly by injecting 6 cc's of chlorpromazine and 10 cc's of azithromycin, but Hal was still active, according to the diary. So at 8:30, Berdella administered 2 more shots of 5 cc's apiece. That calmed Hal down. He apparently was unaware of what happened to him next. 8:40 CF. What does that mean? Hal asked. I believe at that time that was a carrot fuck, Berdella said. Can you tell us what you mean by a carrot fuck? Hal asked. I used a carrot to sodomize the anus. Had you ever done that on any individual before that day? No. Where did you get the idea of doing that? I have no direct source, Berdella said. I guess what I had in the house that would fulfill the job. It is something that came upon you at 8:40 to stick a carrot up his anus? Hal asked. Apparently yes, sir, Berdella said. Berdella injected Hal once more that morning at 11 a.m. and then left for his shop with Hal tied to the bed. When he returned at 3 p.m. that Friday afternoon, he gave Hal another shot of a mixture of tranquilizers. Hal raised a point. Why did you have these needles and syringes in your house? Well, initially it was to take care of my dogs, Berdella said. I was vaccinating my own puppies, doing my own shots to the bitches when they had a litter, doing a lot of home veterinary work. It got to I found I could get tranquilizers through the veterinarian supply, and I did. That's, I guess, when I started using drugs to attract young men. Hal asked, so you could have these when young men came to the house and inject them? Yes. And up to this point, has it always been voluntary on the young men's part? That's correct. Hal theorized to Berdella that being at his shop for 4 hours must have given him some time to cool off a little bit, and Berdella agreed. And yet, Hal said, when you got back to the house, you started up again. That's correct. What was your reason for doing that? I can't give you a defined reason, Berdella said. I think from the point that I tied him up on, I was viewing the situation as irreversible. What do you mean by that? What was I to do? Berdella asked. Untie him? Let him get up? Let him escape? Hal asked. Yes, Berdella said. Either let him go willingly or have him escape. At this point, I guess I just figured out that I had burned my bridges and this is what was going on, and I stayed involved with the situation. At this point, Hal said, demonstrating that Berdella fully knew what he was doing, you knew that there were only 2 alternatives. One, that he escape and report what you had been doing and the consequences that would automatically follow from that. You were aware of that result. I believe so, yes. The other consequence was to never let him leave, Hal asked. I guess that would be a correct way of putting it, Berdella said. At that point, I did not intend or have a desire to kill him, but I was probably under the functioning recollection that there were only 2 options. He stayed here or he leaves. And you picked the option that he would never leave, Hal said. That's correct. That he would never leave. Well, basically, yes. At 5:15, Berdella had made the notation RP, short for rape, because Hal was conscious and resisting. I think at that point he made some kind of response, such as, "Why are you doing this to me?" or "Let me go," or something, Berdella said. Instead, Berdella prepared 2 huge injections totaling 21 cc's of tranquilizers. But at 5:40, by Berdella's notes, Hal was still fighting restraints, eyes fixed, some movement in lips. Berdella also wrote "still fighting" at 6 after the notation CUCR. Hal asked what that meant. Cucumber rape, Berdella said. He said he had never done it before, and again, Hall asked where he got the idea for such a revolting act. Berdella replied, it was just something that was available that could be used in a sexual manner or an assault manner. For the purpose of having sex with him, Hall asked, or for the purpose of assaulting him. I guess assaulting him. To cause him pain? I don't think it caused him any pain. I think he was medicated to the point that he really didn't notice that much, Berdella said. But your purpose was, Hall reminded. I'm not asking if it did. Was your purpose to cause him pain? Probably yes, sir. At 8:45, Berdella hit Hal in the buttocks with a metal ruler. Hall took this opportunity to re-examine Berdella's motive for killing Jerry Howe, his friend, his sex partner, seemingly a harmless kid. Mr. Berdella, Hall asked, was this caused by the fact that he had refused to pay back what you had given him? I think that triggered the events of the 5th and 6th, Berdella said, but the frustration that built up, the anger that built up inside of me prior to that, I guess, is what allowed this to happen. Not just anger towards Mr. Howe, certainly. That's correct. But anger towards all of these young men. That's correct. You thought these young men were using you. Yes, and this was your way of getting back at them. Or being able to recast myself, Berdella said, in a role that would allow me to deal with the reality that I was going through. Possibly the way I handled situations prior to this. I saw myself in a weak state. This was a way where I was no longer weak and helpless. But predominant? Yes. At 9:45, Berdella said the notation front F was short for front fuck, which would not have been sodomy. What is a front fuck? Hall asked. Just using the leg area as a friction spot, Berdella said. He changed Hal's gag and washed his mouth. Hal fought him weakly, and the notation at 10, that he was no longer living, Berdella said, dead. Hall looked at the log and said 10. The entry is 2 letters, D-D. Yes, dead. Is that all that meant, dead? Hall asked. Yes. So he would have died on Friday, July 6th, at 10 p.m. And what did he die of? Hall asked. The best I could tell, either because of the gag or the medications, that he either asphyxiated on vomit or the combination of the gag and the medicines were too strong for him to be able to catch breath or breathe, Berdella said. Your intent throughout this, I guess it would be approximately 28 hours of torture, Hall said, would have been to torture him. I don't think at this point. With Jerry, torture really didn't step into the picture, Berdella said. It may have started with Robert Sheldon, who is next and slightly involved with Mark Wallace, but it wasn't until I got to James Ferris that I intentionally tortured anyone. But it was to cause Mr. Hal pain, Hall asked. Yes. And to assault him. Yes. In the course of that assault, you used narcotics, Hall said. Restraints, Berdella added. And sex, Hall said. Right. And he died from those, Hall said. Yes. Hall asked Berdella how he had known Jerry Howe was dead. Berdella said that Hal hadn't been breathing, and when Berdella had tried mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and pressing on his chest, nothing happened. At that time, Hall said, then what did you do? After thinking a while how to handle the situation, I first moved him down to the basement, Berdella said. And how did you move him to the basement? I just drug him down. You say you thought a while on how to handle the situation, Hall said. What alternatives did you come up with while you were thinking up there in the bedroom? The only one in my mind that would work was to dismember the body, Berdella said. First, I was going to dismember the body and wrap it and put it in pieces, and it just occurred to me to just set the stuff out Monday morning for the trash to pick up. Hall for the first time asked about accomplices. From that time that you knew he was dead to the time that you drug his body down and you came back up, had you called anyone? Hall asked. No. During the 2 days of July 5th and July 6th, 1984, Hall said, "Was there anyone else living in your house?" No. During the time July 5th and July 6th, while Jerry Howell was alive and bound upstairs, had anyone come to your house? No. What did you do then after you got downstairs? Hall asked. I secured one of the antique pulleys that I had to a beam and hung him, Berdella said. Drug him feet first so that I could drain the blood from his body. I take it you also took a photograph of him hanging upside down, Hall asked. Several photographs, yes. What was your purpose in doing this? I guess forming some kind of trophy or record of the event, Berdella said. I think my feelings were somewhere along those lines. You had, in fact, photographed several of the events that occurred while Jerry Howell was alive in your house, Hall said. That's correct. And why did you want a record of these events? Hall asked. Initially, I don't know. Did you later, after this, go back and go through those photographs on occasions? Hall asked. Yes. And what was your reason for going back and going through those photographs? I was using them for stimulation for masturbation, Berdella said. Next, Berdella detailed how he placed a large cooking pot beneath Jerry Howell's head and made incisions with a knife on the inside of Howell's elbows and on the jugular vein in his neck to drain his blood. Berdella left Howell's body suspended overnight and then through most of the next day, Saturday, as he went to work at his shop. While he went around the flea market, he thought of ways to dispose of the body. When he got home that evening, he put on a cook's apron and gathered several sharp cooking and boning knives, as well as the electric chainsaw. He poured out the blood, then laid a sheet of black plastic on the floor and began the dismemberment. For cuts through joints, he used the knives. When he had to cut through bone, for example, when he separated Jerry Howell's head from his body, he used the chainsaw. Using newspaper, he wrapped all the body parts and placed them into several plastic trash bags. The trash bags were then stuffed into several empty dog food bags, and the paper dog food bags were all placed into one large trash bag. Hall asked, "Did you have any remorse at this time for what had happened?" I want to know if at that stage I was able to feel remorse. That is something that, in trying to reconstruct all these events, to find out the point where I stopped having feelings such as remorse. What were your feelings? Hall asked. First ones were disposing of the crime, I guess, Berdella said. Not just of the body, but the crime. By Sunday evening when I got home, Paul Howe Sr. called looking for Jerry, and from that point on I had to deal with a lot of pressure and then eventually threats from Paul Howe. And I believe that trying to deal with those threats and that pressure probably deviated me away from the chance to start having feelings, emotions, just dealing with it on a personal level, as opposed to trying to survive Paul Howe. So you're saying, Hall said, that your main thoughts starting on Sunday evening were how to survive Howell or how to survive the authorities, and you had no feelings basically for what you had done to Mr. Howell. That's correct. Berdella worked in his shop again on Sunday. That night he finished bagging Howell's remains, as well as Howell's clothes, the needles and drugs he'd injected Howell with, the pulley he suspended Howell with. All were ready for pickup the next morning between 6 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. on Monday. Berdella took 4 or 5 trash bags out to the curb, then stood by a window at the front of the house to wait for the garbage truck. He estimated the truck came by between 8 and 9 a.m. Hall asked, "Did you go out there when he picked up the trash bags?" "No. You just watched from your house." "Yes." "Did you save any parts of Howell's body?" "None." "Other than the actual dismembering or cutting up, did you skin Mr. Howell?" "No." "Did you perform any sexual acts on Mr. Howell after he was dead?" "No." "Other than the pictures showing Mr. Howell hanging upside down, did you take any pictures of the dismembering process?" "No." "Any pictures of the body packed up?" "No." Hall moved next to Berdella's photographs, all enlarged to 8 by 10 inches, with a set given to Berdella. The first set of pictures were shots the police had figured were of Jerry Howe. One by one, from the upside-down picture through the carrot and cucumber assaults, Berdella unhesitatingly identified each one. One showed a syringe sticking out of Howe's thigh muscle. Prosecutor Hall now shifted the discussion to Robert Sheldon. Berdella related meeting Sheldon through Kellogg and Simmons at Quincy Research Center. After an experimental program ended at Quincy, Kellogg and Simmons invited many of the graduates, including Sheldon, to a party at Berdella's house. Kellogg told people they could get shots of Thorazine from Berdella, and Berdella said he agreed to give them. It was, I guess, my connection with the group, Berdella said. Prior to probably 81 or 82, I was pretty staunchly anti-drug. I found that was not a way to get involved with people in the Westport area, specifically gays or the bisexual crowd. For having a little drugs or a little booze around, you're a lot more popular. From time to time, Sheldon roomed with Berdella, paying some rent, drinking heavily, having no physical contact with Berdella. Sometimes, Berdella said, Sheldon would drink whatever income he had, fail to pay the rent, and Berdella would ask him to leave. One of these times was in the winter of 1984. Berdella said, and again in early 1985, months after Jerry Howe had been killed. One of these times was in the winter of 1984, Berdella said, and again in early 1985, months after Jerry Howe had been killed. Berdella was having trouble remembering exact dates, but then Hall handed him a calendar for 1985, on which Berdella had written extensively. In January, he wrote RS on binge, meaning Sheldon was drinking extensively, but Sheldon normally would at least acknowledge the debt he owed Berdella, and occasionally show up with a check. Hall asked, "We have a different situation than we had with Mr. Howe in the fact that he really hadn't let you down." Berdella replied, "Other than the annoyance of his behavioral pattern when he was drinking, that is probably a correct statement." One observation is Berdella sometimes used a lot of words to say just the word yes, and that was probably because of his penchant for being intellectual and precise. Looking at his calendar, Berdella said that Sheldon appeared on his doorstep again on April 10th, 1985, asking to stay for a couple of days. Hall then handed Berdella 4 sheets of paper, the first of which had 4-10 on the top. Berdella said they were his notes on Sheldon's capture and torture. The first entry was 9:30, asleep. Sheldon had fallen asleep on Berdella's first-floor couch. At about 9:30, Berdella said, I had the intentions of trying to drug him and keep him. Berdella gave Sheldon several injections into his arm and shoulder, some of which Sheldon absent-mindedly brushed away as if a bug were biting him. Hall asked why Berdella wanted to capture Sheldon. His behavior was becoming annoying, Berdella said, adding that when Sheldon kept showing up unannounced, expecting accommodations, it becomes an inconvenience. Was Sheldon sexually attractive then? Hall asked. No, Berdella said. I don't think anything made him physically attractive to me, Berdella added, then expounded further. The best I can interpret what happened was the impulsive behavior that started with Jerry Howe became a reality for me. You're looking at what would be some of my darkest fantasies becoming my reality, where I was capturing people, controlling them. You don't necessarily need sexual attractiveness to do that. Berdella gave Sheldon another shot at 12:30 a.m., but left him on the couch. 10 minutes later, while Berdella was upstairs, Sheldon was up and walking around. He told Berdella he felt like he'd been poked in the back. When he went toward the kitchen, he stumbled and fell down. Sheldon returned to the couch, and Berdella gave up trying to capture Sheldon that night. The next day, Sheldon told Berdella he had soreness in his muscles, which Berdella figured was from the injections. Berdella took Sheldon to the University of Kansas Medical Center, where Sheldon already had a record from his injuries in a bar fight several months ago. At that point, I had basically written off trying to capture him, Berdella said. Sheldon was examined, given some antibiotics, and released, and spent the night at Berdella's. The next day, Friday, April 12th, Berdella went to work. When he returned home, Sheldon was drunk. Berdella pulled out his previous page of notes on Sheldon and started making entries again. Hall asked, "Had you reformulated the idea of capturing him and dominating him?" "Yes," Berdella said. When Sheldon asked him for a Valium that evening, Berdella suggested he take one of his antibiotics instead. Then, while Sheldon remained on the couch, Berdella emptied the powder from an antibiotic capsule and poured in the powder from 5 crushed sedative tablets. Sheldon conked out, and Berdella began injecting him with a mixture of tranquilizers. By 9 p.m., Sheldon was completely unconscious. Berdella rolled Sheldon onto the floor, took his pants off, and tied his legs together at the ankles. Berdella then carried the limp young man up the stairs, setting Sheldon down on the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors. There, he gave Sheldon a mixed shot of tranquilizers, though he was learning through trial and error that one shot of ketamine was just as powerful and effective for his purposes. He moved Sheldon up to a 3rd-floor bedroom at 10 p.m. Berdella was now warming to the task, and Hall hardly had to ask questions. Berdella began a sort of narration based on his notes, with Hall interrupting only to clarify something. 11:15 is a notation that I butt-fucked him, Berdella declared. Then 11:25, a notation of DC, which is drain cleaner to the left eye, that he had pinpoint pupils at that time, and after the drain cleaner to the eye, he was screaming, although a muffled scream, for about 1 or 2 minutes. Now, when you say drain cleaner, Hall said, are you referring to something like Drano? Basically, yes. And what type of mixture did you use? This was just a cotton swab of the drain cleaner, Berdella said. Placed in his eye? In his left eye, yes. What was your purpose in doing that? Obviously to damage his eye and cause some pain, Berdella said. Perhaps getting into being able to permanently damage his eyes, which would have then made it easier to keep him in to control him. And again, Hall asked, other than his lackadaisical attitude, Mr. Sheldon had not really done anything against you. In retrospect, Berdella said, people like Sheldon and the next individual, Mark Wallace, I expressed some of the anger and frustration that I had toward other people on these individuals. So you had nothing against Sheldon, Hall said. You just found him someone to use to take your frustration out on? Basically. And I take it when you placed the drain cleaner to his left eye that you had no intentions of ever letting him leave your house. Correct. And you formed the intent to kill him at that point, Hall asked. No, Berdella said. The killing of him took place because of coming home and finding Philip Bukovic up on my roof doing some tree work that he was supposed to do 2 or 3 months prior to that. And I knew that Bukovic would come into the house to use the bathroom, etc., and I could see I didn't know what to do with Sheldon other than to suffocate him. Hall pointed Berdella to the early part of the capture. Berdella said he attempted to put a tattoo on Sheldon, but Sheldon was resisting him. Berdella then gave Sheldon a shot of ketamine, knocking Sheldon out. Using a hot needle, Berdella then tattooed the word hot on Sheldon's back left shoulder. I think the act was putting my mark on him, Berdella explained, but what I put on him wasn't significant. Putting your mark on him to stay forever? Hall asked. Yes. Sheldon tried intermittently to plead for mercy, Berdella said, but that didn't stop the torture. Berdella deciphered S and W to mean a soap and water enema he performed on Sheldon before another sodomy with a carrot. The vegetables remained incomprehensible to Hall. To you, this was a way to dominate by sexual pleasure or what? Hall asked. I didn't receive sexual gratification, Berdella clarified. This was a gratification on the level of dominance, control, earning back. Sheldon was tied to a bed and heavily drugged, so Berdella left him at 2:45 a.m., but returned at 6:10 a.m., according to the notes. After checking Sheldon's restraints, Berdella gave him some more injections and had anal intercourse again. Below that entry were the words plugged ears. Berdella told Hall, "I had a caulking gun and just filled his ears with caulking to reduce the amount that he was able to hear." "Caulking, like you would use on your house?" Hall asked. "On windows, yes," Berdella replied. "You placed it into his... Just pumped a little of that into each ear, more to block his hearing than anything else," Berdella said. "It didn't cause any pain or problems that you know of," Hall said. "Correct, but the following night I was able to pull them out," Berdella said. "They apparently did not adhere to the sides of the ear." Hall followed up with, "You didn't want him to hear what was going on, or basically another way of depriving him of some of his senses," Berdella said. "Okay," Hall said. "Again then, this would have been not to prevent escape, but just to dominate him." "Pretty much so, yes." Berdella's experiments in torture continued that morning with what he described as acupuncture with needles. "I tried to see what kind of response using regular hypodermic needles of pain spots, or where spots that he would react to, along the lines of like bamboo under the fingertips." "And that's where you place them, under the fingertip?" "Yes." Berdella couldn't recall Sheldon's reaction to this treatment, but theorized that he was probably sedated enough that he couldn't vocalize it. Berdella went to work that day, and Hall wondered about Berdella's thoughts while he had a man tied up in his house. "Probably a combination of being concerned," Berdella said, "having some fear that he may get loose, but I think probably stimulated by that fear." "The concern would not have been for him," Hall observed. "The concern, if he got loose, you could be in trouble." "I've thought about that for the last 8 months," Berdella said, "and I am in no way trying to defend my actions. I'm still trying myself to understand some of them. These are not people that I thought of. Once I had them bound and was using them, that I thought of them as being people. They became something other than people to me. And the responsibility for my actions, the way I thought about my own actions, the way I thought about myself, I did not see them as people in my mind or the punishment. I didn't concentrate on the punishment. I didn't really concentrate on the possibility of getting caught." Berdella kept going. "I think if you look at any of the pictures, starting with Jerry Howell and the haphazard way he was tied, that I was just responding to the situation. That I didn't have a long-term game plan. I had never thought it out to the level of, what if one of these bodies gets loose?" Hall said, "You didn't think of them as people. You call them bodies. What were they to you? When you were there at work from 1 till 5, you were apparently getting some pleasure with the thought that you were dominating him." "That's correct." "He could not control his surroundings. You controlled them." "That's correct." "What was he at that point besides a source of pleasure?" Hall asked. "Reduced to the level of, say, a blow-up doll or a clay figure you would make as a kid and moving around, having complete control of," Berdella said. "Something that you had created?" "At least had control of, for your enjoyment," Hall said. "I don't know if enjoyment is the word I'd want to use," Berdella said. "Physical and mental satisfaction, possibly." After Berdella returned home that afternoon, he began sodomizing Sheldon again, and Sheldon protested. "You have to let me loose, and you can't do this to me," Berdella recalled his captive saying. Berdella said he responded by hitting Sheldon in the back of his head with a rubber mallet. The injections were continued and duly noted, including a shot of sugar and water, thinking it might have some nutrient value to it, Berdella said. Later that night, at 3 a.m., Berdella wrote EK, which is one of my abbreviations for using the transformer. He said he also used EKG. "Is this the first time you ever used that?" Hall asked. "Yes." "Is this the first individual you have ever used that on?" "That's correct." "And the EK to shoulder and back, would that be the placement?" "Yes," Berdella said. "I think with Sheldon I had 2 hypodermic needles where I would tie wire coming from the transformer to, so I could actually anchor them into the skin." Berdella would then snap on the transformer and shock Sheldon for several seconds. Berdella said he bought the transformer sometime after Jerry Hall died. He wasn't sure just when. I take it then, Hall said, that after you finished with Hal, you had the intent in your mind of torturing other people. No, Berdella said. The first several months, 3 to 5 months, I was repulsed by what had happened to Hal. I couldn't stand to look at the pictures nor the written material. I kept them in a very secure place where no one would find them or be able to get to them. It wasn't until 4 or 5 months after that I started developing an urge to see the photographs, to use them for excitement or masturbation purposes. This would have been 8 to 10 months after you killed Hal, Hall asked. Probably around that time frame, yes, Berdella said. And at that point I think I was starting to build up a desire to catch somebody else. So we're talking about February or March of '85, Hall calculated, when you started going back over what you had done to Hal, finding enjoyment from that? Yes, and thinking in your own mind, it's time to do it again? I was developing it into the conflict, Berdella said, between wanting to do it again and never wanting to know about it, see about it, think about it again. But as the desire to do it grew, I started accumulating drugs again, and Sheldon came along at a point where I guess my ability to resist this compulsive behavior no longer controlled my actions or my thoughts. Berdella toyed with the electrical shocks on Sheldon for only a few minutes, then went to sleep. In the morning, after sodomizing Sheldon, he went to his shop from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. When he came home, he sodomized Sheldon again. He noted that he was binding Sheldon's wrists with piano wire to cause nerve damage to the hands, so that if I ever did untie him, he wouldn't have control or be able to use his hands. The next morning, Monday, April 15th, Berdella went downtown to a trade show and returned to find Bukovic working on his roof, the job Bukovic had agreed to perform weeks earlier. Looking down at his notes, Berdella recalled, I had come home and saw Philip on the roof. Didn't know what to do with Sheldon. Went up, put a plastic bag over his head, and suffocated him. Berdella said he spoke briefly with Bukovic before going inside, telling him that he had to take care of something. Once in the house, Berdella said I took a quick inventory of the drugs that I had available as to whether they would knock Sheldon out quick enough and deep enough that I wouldn't have any problems if Bukovic came into the house. Determining that wasn't possible, I then suffocated him. Berdella had a roll of plastic trash bags on the 3rd floor. He pulled one out, put it over Sheldon's head, and secured it around the neck with a sash or a piece of rope. Hall asked, when you put the trash bag over his head, did you stand there and watch? I watched long enough to take the one photograph, Berdella said, referring to his one shot of the dying man. I took care of a couple of other things on the 3rd floor until I was sure that he was dead. When did you take the photograph showing him there with the... When I first put the bag on, Berdella answered abruptly. While he was still alive? That's correct. As he stood there watching his lungs grasping for air, Hall said, what thoughts came into your mind at that point? Just concerned with dealing about Bukovic, Berdella said. You say you paid no attention to what was happening, Hall asked. Don't remember, Berdella said. Just things that I know I didn't stand over Sheldon the whole time, and I just stayed up on the 3rd floor until he was dead so that I would be there if he had started making any noises, etc. Bukovic stayed around at Berdella's house for about 90 minutes while Sheldon lay dead on the 3rd floor. When Bukovic left, Berdella dragged Sheldon's body to a bathtub in the 3rd floor bathroom, took a razor blade, and made cuts in Sheldon's joints to drain the blood. He waited 4 or 5 hours, then used a boning knife, some razor blades, and a bow saw to dismember Sheldon's body. The legs and arms were amputated that night, but Berdella left the rest of the body in the tub until the following night when he completed the cutting and wrapping of the parts. Now, the head, Hall pointed out. You had different plans for Mr. Sheldon's head than you had with Mr. Howell's body, didn't you? Apparently, yes, Berdella said. What did you do with the head on Monday night after you had cut it off? Hall asked. I think I stuck it in the freezer for a couple of days. Then one evening I took it out in the backyard and buried it. The head was wrapped in a trash bag before being placed in an upright freezer on Berdella's back porch, and then before burying it, Berdella removed the skin and hair. What was your reason for doing this? Hall asked. I don't even understand what my reason for keeping the skull was, Berdella said, so I really don't understand what drove me to remove the skin. No idea why you did that, Hall asked. Not really. How long did you leave the skull buried? Until I buried Pearson's skull back there, Berdella said, which would have been August of, well, it would be earlier than August of 87. May have been a month or two before I got around to exchanging the skulls. Did you retrieve the Sheldon skull before you buried the head of Larry Pearson? I recovered it at the same time I dug the hole to put Pearson's in. Berdella said he put the rest of Sheldon's wrapped body parts in the basement where the cool temperature would keep them from decomposing rapidly and spreading the odor of death through the house. The following Monday, he set the bags out on the curb, and again the bags were taken away uneventfully. Did you have any remorse? Hall asked. I know that's always going to be a question on your part, Berdella said. And it will always be a question of mine. I think at this point, I was insulating myself enough from my own emotions and old feelings that I just didn't deal with it. It's like it didn't happen. It wasn't until I was arrested and brought over here that I ever confronted what I was doing. At this point, Berdella stopped and seemed upset. They took a brief pause, and Berdella had to wipe a tear from his eye, then added, If I've been able to sit here and somewhat objectively discuss the matter, it has been after a very intensive 8 months spent here working with a psychiatrist, the caseworker, Pat, that have allowed me to objectively discuss what's going on. It has taken me 8 months to bring myself to the point that I can sit here at the table and discuss this with you. Hall picked up a sheaf of 19 photos, identified as Sheldon. One of the photos was taken while the 7,700 volts of electricity were coursing through Sheldon's rigid body. Others showed Sheldon being injected or sodomized. Hall then asked Berdella if he ever told anyone prior to his arrest about torturing and killing Sheldon. Berdella said he had not. Hall asked whether any Kansas City policemen knew or had assisted him in torturing his victims, which was a recurrent rumor. Berdella repeatedly said no. Finally, Hall asked, Do you have any idea of why it was you buried Sheldon's head in the backyard? I think I just filed it away for future reference. I can't come up with a direct reason as to why I kept his skull. Berdella paused and then added, Since you have to deal with the families, let me make the statement that it was not kept as any kind of religious occult or any kind of belief reason for keeping the skull. Its significance that it was buried, as best as I can tell, is giving it no more importance than any of the skulls that I had discarded in the trash. That ended day 1 of confessions. Day 2, Hall wanted to be even more thorough as possible. He informed Berdella that he was still under oath and then asked him to relate the story of the murder of Mark Wallace. It would have been midsummer of 85, Berdella began. He explained that when he met Wallace through another man who had been cutting Berdella's lawn. Wallace had been inside Berdella's house once or twice with his friend, but had said almost nothing. Hall handed Berdella 3 sheets of paper, which Berdella instantly identified as his torture logs for Wallace. When you saw that, Hall said, you immediately thought this related to Mr. Wallace. What was it about it that makes you think it was Mr. Wallace? Well, Berdella said, the first notation, tool shed. Berdella recalled that a severe thunderstorm swept through the city the night of June 22nd, 1985, and when his dogs wouldn't stop barking, he found Wallace huddled inside the backyard tool shed. "I invited him in the house to dry out and get warm," Berdella said. "We talked for about an hour." For the most part, he talked. He was very drunk and very depressed. Looking down at his notes, Berdella continued, "I gave him, at 12:45, an injection of 1.5 cc's of chlorpromazine in his vein with his cooperation." Hall stopped him and asked how much he knew of Wallace's background. Berdella thought Wallace was gay, lived near 43rd and Oaks Streets, and wasn't sure whether Wallace used drugs. Hall asked, "Did you have any idea about his family members, or—" "That's one of the things that we covered in the conversation for that first hour," Berdella said. "What did he tell you about that?" Hall asked. "That his mother was out of the country," Berdella said. "That he really didn't know where she was at. He had a couple of sisters in town, but they didn't like him to hang around because he was so depressed and depressing." "Now, the 12:45 injection," Hall said, returning to Berdella's log. "You said that was with his consent." "Yes. Could you explain then to us what happened?" "He was very uptight, tense, depressed," Berdella said. "Even with the alcohol that he had in him, he didn't appear that he would be able to get to sleep that evening. I volunteered to give him a shot of chlorpromazine, telling him that it maybe would calm him down and relax him, and he readily accepted. So that made me believe that he had shot drugs previously." Hall asked, "But it was not at that time that you formed any intent to capture him." "That's correct. But 30 minutes later, with Wallace asleep on Berdella's couch, something in Berdella's mind changed." "Now, when you went down there at 1:15, Hall said, at that time, had you formed the intent to capture him?" "I either had formed it or was in the process of finalizing the decision." "What led you to make the decision on Mark Wallace?" "Aside from any emotional decisions that would have affected me," Berdella answered, "angry from some other situation or under duress, it was just that he was here. There was nothing to really link him to my house that night, and that he didn't have family that would come around looking for him." Hall asked what other elements might have affected Berdella. Berdella said he had taken Freddie Kellogg to Small Claims Court earlier that month, and he was trying to track down Foster Simmons for some money Simmons owed him. He looked at a calendar from 1985 on which he had jotted what was going on, and remembered the tension he felt trying to wring his money out of Kellogg and Simmons. Moving his attention back to the Wallace log, Berdella recalled pricking at Wallace's arm with a needle to see if Wallace would notice. He did. 30 minutes later, Berdella tried again. This time, Wallace was sleeping soundly. Berdella injected 5 cc's of chlorpromazine and made a note of it in his log. He snapped a photo of Wallace and made a note of that too. Several minutes later, he gave Wallace 2 more injections, including one of ketamine. "Now, the ketamine," Hall asked, "you found in your experience was extremely effective in knocking people out." "Yes," Berdella said, adding, "I may not have had that experience by the time I did this, but this would probably be part of the learning process." Berdella continued injecting Wallace and keeping a running total of the amount of drugs he'd used. He began shooting Wallace in the neck, and Wallace would sometimes rouse incoherently, then fall into a stupor. When Berdella felt Wallace was sufficiently incapacitated, he undressed him and tied him, writing down, "out like a light." He then sodomized him twice, once with a carrot. At 4 a.m., Berdella carried Wallace up to a 3rd-floor bedroom. Wallace's hands were tied behind his back, his ankles bound together. Wallace occasionally tried to speak, but he wasn't making any sense, Berdella said. Berdella sodomized him at 4:30, 5:30, and 6 a.m., according to his notes. "I want to ask on these," Hall interrupted, "and I think it appears in the other diaries. When you have the BF for the anal sodomy and FF for the front F, you have those in a box. Was there any reason why you have them in a box?" "Just to be able to notice them or separate them from the rest of the copy," Berdella said, as if he had been highlighting class notes before an exam. "When you were making notes," Hall asked, "did they also have some use for you during the occurrence to have these notes?" Yes, Berdella replied, to keep a kind of record of the responses, what reaction each one would have to what drugs. This wasn't a set down and planned scientific experiment by any means, but just to have some record or reference to it in the future or at that time. Moving down the page, Berdella read, between 6:45 and 7:05 there was front fucking, a notation about alligator clips. No drugs at this point. He was fighting and resisting. Okay, Hall said, what are the alligator clamps? These are just the little clips I guess you could find at most hardware stores, Berdella said. What would you do with the alligator clips? I attached them to his nipples. Why would you have been doing that? At this point, Berdella said, I would have to say that I was beginning to get into sadomasochism. Hall was a little confused. Prior to this, with the other individuals, Hall said, you did not consider yourself to be getting into sadomasochistic sex. I know it would look and sound contradictory, Berdella replied, but up until this point, there was a pretty clear separation between inflicting pain and then at another time having sex. It was only, I think, at this point where I first got into inflicting pain during the period where I was having sex. The injections and the sex continued through the morning. Intermittently, Berdella would also club Wallace in the back of the head with a rubber mallet to cause a little disorientation. As the time approached for Berdella to open his shop on Sunday morning, he administered 2 large injections to Wallace in the neck and buttocks, then headed out. Berdella returned home at 5 p.m. and found Wallace sitting up, trying to free himself. Berdella gave him 2 more stiff doses of the drugs. Consulting his notes, Berdella said he sodomized Wallace from 5:30 to 6:10 p.m., then began playing around with needles. I'm sorry, Hall said. I didn't understand. Playing around with the needles, Berdella repeated, the hypodermic tips, to see what kind of response the body or muscles would give. Where would you be doing that? It says back, Berdella said, referring to his log. So you would have just been putting the needles, puncturing the back with the needles? Yes. And do what? Kind of a bizarre acupuncture, Berdella said, trying to see if there were spots or areas that the body would still respond to. By 6:30, Wallace was completely unconscious again, so Berdella turned to his electrical transformer and hooked up the wires to alligator clips. He pulled out the photos police had figured were of Wallace and handed them to Berdella. Berdella explained when and where he took each one and what he was doing to Wallace when the photo was taken. Third photo is an illustration of a syringe in his anus with soap coming out, Berdella explained. This is when I gave him the enema. When he finished going through the pictures, Berdella observed, I should note that there is one photo, at least one photo, that is missing, and that was the second photo of the attempted fist fuck. So Berdella even recalled photos that he had taken that were not included. Hall just said okay and continued on. Next notation is 7, Berdella said, and at that point I came up and checked on him, and he was no longer breathing. Did you check for any other vital signs? Hall asked. Well, at that point I turned him over, Berdella said. Checked his eyes to see if there was any response on that. Checked for any kinds of sign of life at all, and there was none. Perhaps it's an unfair question to ask, Hall said, but do you have any opinion as to what caused his death, what he died from? I think mainly just a combination of the drugs, the gag, the lack of oxygen, Berdella replied. How about striking the back of his head with the mallet, Hall said. Were you striking him hard, or how would you describe the blows that you administered to him? Firm, but not overly hard, Berdella said. I guess what you would call a mild concussion. But these, the drugs, the gag, the striking, were administered by you to him in the course of restraining him against his will, Hall asked. Yes, and his death would have been approximately 7 on Sunday evening, June the 23rd, 1985. That would be correct. Berdella untied Wallace, dragged him into the bathtub in the third-floor bathroom, and made cuts in his arms and groin and leg areas to allow the blood to flow out. Berdella said he had dismembered 4 of his victims in his bathtub and dismembered only Jerry Howell and Larry Pearson in the basement. Since the trash collectors were coming the next morning, Berdella had to slice up Wallace's body that night, but he was a small individual, so it was nowhere near as awkward nor bulky as Hal and Sheldon were. None of Wallace's body parts were kept, and Berdella stuffed Wallace's clothes into the trash bags as well. Was any part of his body sold to anyone? Hall asked. Let me state at this time that I understand that the police had investigated the possibility as to whether I was cutting these bones up and selling them as beads and jewelry. No. Hall asked if anyone else was involved in the killing, if there were any other photos or notes. Berdella said no. Hall was working up to something. Did you record the events through a tape recorder? No. Make any notes on a tape recorder? I never used a tape recorder on any of these events, Berdella said. Never? Never. If I can, Berdella added, I believe I know the tape that you are thinking of, the one that's 3 pages of notes that were initially determined to be the types of sounds that a person is clubbed, drug across the room, etc. Hall pulled out the transcript that Detective Hearn, that was the sex investigator, had prepared of the audio tape pulled from under Berdella's bed. The tape had been sent to the FBI for possible enhancement. Berdella also had that transcript handy. If you want to look at it, Berdella said, that is a tape of Philip Bukovic masturbating on the 3rd floor. This sounded like complete bull to the police and prosecutors. Hall looked down at the transcript and read aloud. There are several entries of bitch. I'm going to have to kill you, motherfucker. I'll kill you. Movement back and forth on the bed, or what appears to be moving back and forth on the bed. You're saying that this was just a recording of someone masturbating? Hall asked. Yes, Berdella said. This is Philip Bukovic talking to his penis. The others in the room said nothing, and Berdella sensed they didn't believe him. I'm serious, Berdella said. I'm not trying to make this up. Are you present while he's doing this? Hall asked. No, Berdella answered. He did not know that I had a microphone in his room, up in the front room, on the 3rd floor, that I just ran the cord down the heating duct to the gallery area on the 2nd floor and could attach a tape recorder to it. How do you know that he was masturbating? Hall asked. Did you confront him with that? That you had the tape, or what? I think if you listen to the tape, Berdella said, and you start hearing some of this stuff along with the bed movements, it was pretty clear that he was masturbating. Are you saying the only voice on that tape was Philip Bukovic's? I believe so, yes. And that has nothing to do with any type of torture activity. That's correct. Back to Mr. Wallace, Hall said. I'm just, if it's possible, trying to find out why. Do you have any idea why Mr. Wallace, who you didn't really know that well, why him? Berdella inhaled deeply, then began. I think at this point it just came down to he was there. I think my attitude, the events of 85, I responded to the Jerry Howell incident initially with disgust, fear, and running into the frustration of these individuals that I lived with and dealt with the past. My attitude became, if they're there, if they make themselves available, fuck it. I just give up caring anymore. I became calloused. When you first started with Mr. Wallace, Hall said, at that time, what was your intent to do? What did you intend to have happen? I don't think objectively I ever consciously had an intent, Berdella said. It became, they didn't catch me the first time. They're not going to catch me now. Who gives a shit? To do what? Hall asked. Berdella at this time waited a moment trying to think of an example, and this is when he brought up the film The Collector that I talked about in episode 2. And recalling The Collector, he said that that's probably the first clear event that became a mental fantasy of his that relates to any of this. There were incidents and thoughts prior to the movie, but that movie just gave him the framework to be able to fantasize it. And in 84, he started following his dark fantasies, and it made them come true. They moved on to Walter Ferris. Berdella recounted how he met Ferris through Gene Shaw at the flea market, how he once sold them a bottle of chlorpromazine and later traded it for marijuana, how he sold them some marijuana even though a stranger accompanied them. In early 1984, 1985, when Berdella was questioned by Independence police about a drug sale, he immediately figured that Ferris and Shaw had set him up. He didn't see Ferris or Shaw again until September 1985, after he already killed Hal, Sheldon, and Wallace. He picked up Ferris hitchhiking on September 24th, beginning a 2-day odyssey of meetings with Ferris and Shaw that led to Ferris's capture. Berdella grew increasingly annoyed by the stoned pair's late-night phone calls, unexpected visits, and rooting around in his belongings while he was gone. On September 26th, after Ferris and Shaw had broken into Berdella's house and kept him up until daylight, Ferris called and asked Berdella to meet him at the Midnight Sun, a gay bar in Midtown Kansas City. Berdella, still trying to find Kellogg or Simmons, had errands to run, but ended up joining Ferris at 7:30 p.m. He knew this because his log started with the entry 7:30 bar, and Ferris was written just below that. Ferris asked if he could stay at Berdella's house, but first he wanted to pick up some clothes and personal items from his house. At that point in time, Hall said, when you're at the Midnight Sun and you offer to let him crash at your house for a couple of days again, had you formed an intent to capture him? Yes. What was it that caused you to form that intent on capturing Ferris? At that point, Berdella said, specific anger towards Ferris, both for getting me involved with the situation on this drug agent and his behavior over the last couple of days. He presented himself basically as somebody that nobody would really miss or look for, with the exception of possibly Gene Shaw. With his knowledge, Hall stated, and with what you believe he had done to you and the nuisance he had been, you had formed the intent to go ahead and capture him. That's correct. Other than capturing him, did you form the intent also to torture him? I don't know, Berdella said. I don't think I captured him with the intent of electrodes, etc. I had captured him with the intent of anger and probably hurting him. Killing him? No, at that point I didn't capture any of these individuals with the intent of and purpose being to kill them. I was capturing them first, and then what developed. Berdella and Ferris picked up some of Ferris' belongings, then drove to Charlotte Street, where they arrived about 8:30 p.m. Between 8:30 and 9, I prepared something to eat, Berdella said, which were some microwaved burritos and chili. And in the chili that I gave to him, I had crushed up some of these tranquilizer pills. In addition to 2 volumes that Ferris had requested, Berdella had added several powdered tranquilizers and sedatives to Ferris's dinner. Ferris ate the chili on Berdella's bed in the second-floor bedroom, and then passed out about 9 p.m. Within minutes, Ferris was snoring, so Berdella pulled Ferris's clothes off, and then tested his reactions with a needle. Ferris didn't move. The cycle of injections, photographs, and sodomy began anew. Over the next several hours, Berdella sodomized Ferris with his finger, his penis, a carrot, and a cucumber. Ferris was tied to the bed and gagged, occasionally reacting slightly to the repeated assaults. At midnight, Berdella noted that Ferris was fighting, so he restarted his program of 7,700-volt electric shocks. He ran the electric current through kitchen spatulas this time, and I used the electricity on his buttocks, his shoulders, and testicles. So, Hall asked, these are similar to the paddles we see when they're trying to revive someone's heart. Are you talking about that type of situation? In an obviously much more amateur operation, yes, Berdella said. And what caused you to develop this system? I guess because the ways that I had used the electricity before were kind of short and minimal. I probably, in my mind, when doing this, gave me an opportunity to move around where the pain would be without having to connect and disconnect. And leave the machine on and just go from one place to the other? Yes. Was he conscious at any time? Hall asked about Ferris. He was conscious enough to. I think he asked, what the fuck do you think you're doing? But they were not connected sentences, one sentence didn't relate to the prior sentence. Well, what would some of his comments be? Hall asked. It would be the equivalent of him yelling at me, Berdella said, as far as, why are you doing this type comments. I don't have any specific notes. How long would you have performed this EKG? on the different parts of his body at that particular time, Hall asked. Probably no more than 2 to 4 minutes, 2 to 5 minutes at one time. Berdella's torture was becoming more viciously painful, and his acupuncture with hypodermic needles was tested on Ferris in the most painful areas imaginable. The sodomies followed through the night. 5 o'clock, the patient started moving, and I gave him 2 to 3 shots of the electricity, Berdella said, using the term patient as if clinically discussing a surgical procedure. No notation as to what part of the body. Berdella also kept injecting his patient with heavy doses of tranquilizers. Daylight approached, but Berdella continued his sadistic practices with unceasing diligence. The torture didn't relent until Berdella left for work at 10:45 a.m. Berdella's medical tendencies really started to flower about 4:45 p.m. when he had the idea to take Ferris's temperature. It was 99 degrees. Berdella injected 3 cc's of penicillin into Ferris's buttocks to fight the slight fever. You knew that he needed medical attention, Hall said. That's correct. You were trying to give that medical attention. Give what help I could at the time, yes. And your reason or purpose for trying to give medical attention to him, Hall asked. To keep him from getting worse or possibly dying, Berdella said. Would this have been for his sake or just to keep him available to you? Well, to help him recover from whatever problems he was having at that time. The only problem that he was giving a direct sign of was running a fever. Berdella continued to take copious notes, even checking Ferris's eyes to see if his pupils were dilated. By now, Ferris was delirious, barely resisting as Berdella kept up his nonstop sexual assaults. Through the evening, Berdella maintained a steady stream of injections and sodomies, including 3 more sexual assaults between 11:15 and 11:30 p.m. Ferris was objecting, but just barely, Berdella recalled. He wrote in his log, unable to sit up more than 10 to 15 seconds. The other concluding entries, 11:30, 2.5 cc's, cat and K plus shoulder, gag loose, no resit and retie, 11:45, very delayed breathing, snoring, 12:86. What do you mean by delayed breathing? Hall asked. Instead of being a regular process, you could hear that there were delays in him breathing in suck or exhaling the breath. It wasn't a continuous pattern, Berdella said. Did that indicate to you at that time that he was having some problems? Hall asked. In retrospect, yes, but at the time it didn't, Berdella said. Delayed breathing was a fairly common side effect or symptom of the tranquilizations. So you didn't think that there was anything out of the ordinary, Hall said, other than a normal reaction to the drugs you had been injecting. That's correct. Berdella moved to the last line on the page. When I checked on him at 12, however, he was then dead. Why did you put 86 for dead? Hall asked. Basic terminology in the restaurant business, Berdella said, which I had been in, was 86. It meant anything from thrown out to stop the project, just things brought to an end and or discarded. Does 86 also, Hall asked, or the expression 86 similarly mean to kill or that he's dead? That would be the terminology that could also be used when 86 went into the general public's use of the term. So, by what we have here, Hall concluded, Mr. Ferris would have died in the late night hours of Friday, September the 27th. Yes. At that time, had you formed the intent to capture him? I either had formed it or was in the process of finalizing the decision. What led you to make the decision on Mark Wallace? Aside from any emotional decisions that would have affected me, Berdella answered, angry from some other situation or under duress, it was just that he was here. There was nothing really to link him to my house that night, and that he didn't have family that would come around looking for him. Hall asked what other elements might have affected Berdella. Berdella said he had taken Freddie Kellogg to small claims court earlier that month, and he was trying to track down Foster Simmons for some money Simmons owed him. He looked at a calendar from 1985 on which he had jotted what was going on, and remembered the tension he felt trying to wring his money out of Kellogg and Simmons. Because he was dead by midnight. That's correct. Was his death then caused by the constant injections of the drugs acepromazine and chlorpromazine and ketamine? Hall asked. Obviously, not in a medical position to make that determination. It was either the drugs in connection with his physical response and also on the basis that his gag had just been retied and in response to that. So by overdose or asphyxiation or a combination of the two? That's correct. As with his previous two victims, Berdella dragged Ferris to the bathroom on the 3rd floor, made cuts in his arteries, and let the blood drain out of his body. The following evening, he dismembered the body, wrapped it in various paper and plastic bags, filled several large garbage bags, and set them out on the curb. Monday morning, watching the bags from his house until they were picked up. And what was your purpose in keeping his driver's license identification? Hall asked. Really no reason other than to keep it. Some sort of memento? Probably at most, Berdella said. Hall then picked up photo enlargements, which had been sorted into one group, all thought to be James Ferris. Berdella flipped through each one and described what was happening when the picture was taken and what Berdella was doing. In some of the photos, Berdella's arms or legs were visible as he held the camera over Ferris, sodomizing or torturing him. Berdella pointed out one photo that depicted Larry Pearson, not Ferris, and said that one of the Ferris pictures had been placed with the Jerry Howell group. Although the victims' faces weren't always visible in the pictures, Berdella knew right away who was being photographed and at which stage in the torture process. Prosecutor Hall suggested that the group break for lunch, but Berdella raised his hand slightly and said, "Let me make one brief notation while we're still on the Ferris case." Hall looked at Berdella, but didn't object, so Berdella continued. Ferris had apparently at one point been in an auto accident, which I believe by his statements had broken his nose again. He had a very deep, raspy voice. This was one of the things that controlled the volume of his vocal. He couldn't yell loud, or he had a voice that wouldn't allow him to yell rather loudly, even if he had a gag out of his mouth. That was something that I observed and which led to the injection of the Drano into some of the other people's throats to try to destroy or damage some of their vocal cords. Hall asked, "You mean that because of Ferris's condition, that he just naturally cannot call for help or scream out?" "Yes, loudly." "And that was nothing you did by injection." "That's correct." "But after you saw the advantage of that, you started doing it." "Right. And what did you use to do this?" "Either liquid Drano or one of the generic things that would be comparable," Berdella said. "And what did you believe that the product would do to the throat?" "It would damage," Berdella said. "Well, I didn't use the throat. I just concentrated right on the voice box." "By injection?" "By injection, usually trying to make sure I didn't go all the way through the throat to where it would be going down, but just in on the outside area directly around the throat box, trying not to go all the way through." "And what do you think that would do?" "Damage the voice box enough so that he would have a raspy voice and not be able to yell for help loudly," Berdella explained. "Did you think that would be permanent?" Hall asked. "Well, this started with Todd Stoops," Berdella said. "After he had been there about a week, I injected his throat initially rather cautiously because I didn't know whether it would cause problems like poisoning, whether the Drano would stay basically in the throat area and concentrate its damage on the throat." Berdella stopped momentarily, then another thought occurred to him. "May I also point out that, as I have read some of the police reports, that I've never injected any kind of drain cleaner, battery acid, etc. into anybody's veins or into any muscle or part of their body for any kind of discomfort, and any time I used it, it was strictly on the voice box area." Hall replied, "Okay." Break was over. Hall said, "In the chronology of the next individual we need to talk about is a man by the name of Todd Stoops, and you told us in your opening statement that you believe that his capture began in June of '86. Is that correct?" "I believe so, yes. And apparently it started at the Liberty Park. That's correct. It is my understanding, Hall said, that you had known Mr. Stoops for some time prior to that. I had not seen him for about a year prior to seeing him at Liberty Park, Berdella said, but I had previously. He had stayed over at my house previously. Berdella started to recount how he met Stoops at 10th and McGee in the spring of 1984. Hall asked if 10th and McGee was a common place for chicken hawks to sell themselves. Berdella answered, as if confused, that chicken hawk is not along with my understanding of the terminology. I grew up believing that the chicken hawks were the persons that were young men or women before they had any signs of puberty. It would be untrue to categorize the kids, the young men, down on 10th and McGee as being children. Would you agree, Hall said, that the people down at 10th and McGee were men who sold themselves as prostitutes to other men, another man and or other woman? The term chicken hawk means different things to different people. In some cities, a chicken hawk is the person who pays for the prostitute, who presumably preys on the young chickens. In Kansas City, police call the male prostitutes chicken hawks because they often turn their customers into victims, robbing, conning, or beating them, rather than performing sexually. In Berdella's twist on this, the downtown male prostitutes didn't qualify as chicken hawks because they weren't young enough. Berdella went downtown that night intending to meet up with Lamar Rich, but Rich didn't show at the agreed-upon time. Instead, Stoops wandered over and got into Berdella's car. Berdella took Stoops to a dope house to pick him up some Ritalin and Tolwyn, and Stoops and his wife moved in. Several days later, even though Kellogg and Simmons were also living in Berdella's house, Berdella thought he was helping Stoops and his wife kick the street life, get themselves straightened out. Neither did, and the young couple moved out for good in late July. Berdella said he saw Stoops occasionally around 10th and McGee whenever Berdella was window shopping, as he put it, not necessarily buying. Nearly 2 years later, on June 17, 1986, Berdella drove to Liberty Memorial Park, still looking for Kellogg or anyone who knew where he was. Cruising around the traffic loop in front of the park's huge monument, Berdella saw Stoops and pulled over. He first approached the car like he didn't recognize me, Berdella recalled, and then when he did recognize me, he got right in. The two men chatted like old buddies, and Berdella commented that he hadn't seen Stoops in a while. Stoops said he'd been in jail in Oklahoma and that he and his wife had split up. Stoops asked Berdella to take him to a drug house to buy some one-and-ones, and after they did that, the two men headed to Charlotte Street. Was he going to spend the night with you at your house? Hall asked. At that point, we didn't get into any discussions, Berdella said. After about an hour or so, I made the decision to try to capture him. And where did you make that decision? Either in the car or over at my house, Berdella said. When we got to my house, as he was preparing his shot, I gave him some milk that had Advils crushed up in it. They dissolved easily. You had crushed up some Advils in some milk? Hall asked, wondering how aspirin would knock out Stoops. Berdella said that these weren't over-the-counter pills, and Advil may not have been the right name of the drug, but they were rather potent, and they dissolved in liquid and were non-tasteable in food. Between sips of milk, Stoops prepared his shot of Ritalin and Tolwyn. Berdella left the room and crushed some tranquilizers. Stoops said he was hungry, and the only thing I had to give him to eat was a peanut butter sandwich, Berdella said. So I just put the tranquilizer in the peanut butter that was on the sandwich and his milk that he drank with the sandwich. Number 5 was about to go down. Hall wondered what it was about this one, this particular person of all the people Berdella met or knew or entertained. What was it that formed your intent to capture Todd Stoops? Hall asked. I was very sexually attracted to him, Berdella said, when he had stayed at my house before, especially when he started getting into head trips about the sexual aspects of it. This became a cause of stress and anxiety for me. Berdella had already told Hall that Stoops had agreed to provide his services in exchange for room and board during his first stay in 1984, but he was preoccupied with what his wife would think, and the whole time he would be with me, obviously. He was very concerned about Rachel and wanted to be with her, and this caused a great deal of frustration and anxiety, Hall asked. That's correct. So the sexual frustration and anxiety that he had caused you in the past was part of the reason for you deciding to capture him. That's correct. What else? Again, he was very attractive, well-built, Berdella said, and that from what he was telling me, with Rachel gone, he wasn't really associating with anybody in Kansas City on any kind of regular basis. And you found that attractive for what reason? That no one would come looking for him. Any other reason why you decided to capture him? Not any logical reasons, no. Any other reasons, Hall repeated. Just to deal with a way of, Berdella said, I guess handling other stresses that would be in my life. It became a stress release, and to have a sexual say with a sex toy. Stoops ate his peanut butter sandwich and milk and never left Berdella's house again. He was alive for about 2 more weeks, Berdella said. Hall pulled out Deposition Exhibit 14, 4 sheets of lined paper from a stenographer's notebook. Berdella identified them as the first part of his Stoops torture log. Exhibit 14A was 8 more pages of lined notebook-sized paper, which detailed the Stoops captivity to its conclusion. Berdella and Hall looked at the first page of the log and saw that Berdella had written 6:17, and below that 11:30 Park. Stoops apparently took his shot of Ritalin and Tolwyn at 2:30 that afternoon, then later went upstairs to Berdella's bed and passed out. At 5:20 p.m., Berdella began the first of a series of injections of ketamine, and at 5:50, the first of many sodomies was committed. At 7, Berdella, ever the clinician, held one of Stoops' eyes open and snapped a photo of it to show that the pupils were fixed. Stoops wasn't tied to the bed until 7:40, after which Berdella administered the electricity, as he sometimes called it. This was followed by more sexual assaults, and then another jolt of electricity at 9:45 p.m. Though he hadn't written it down, Berdella remembered that he was using spatulas as his conductor between the electric wires and the skin, and in this particular session, one of the spatulas was placed near Stoops' eyes. When you say to the eyes, Hall started, but Berdella cut in. This was with the eyes closed, Berdella said, but using them as one of the areas that the electricity would enter. So the eyelid, yes. Through the eye? At this point, I was trying to blind him, Berdella said. And why were you trying to permanently blind him? Hall asked. To disable him as far as any long-term captivity. The routine continued through the evening. A cucumber was used for the first time on Stoops at 11 p.m., followed by more electric shocks. Stoops would revive at times, struggle briefly with his restraints, then fall back into unconsciousness. The sexual assaults kept up into the morning hours, along with more injections. Berdella recounted sodomies at 1:40, 2, 4, and 4:40, always in a straightforward manner. 2 was buttocks, a butt fuck, Berdella said, basically translating his notes. Turned to front down, he read, explaining Stoops' position in the bed. Quiet. 4, again, butt fuck, no other notations made. 4:30, 4 ace promazine hot, would have meant that I used the crushed tablets as opposed to a liquid injectable. Injection to the arms, some reaction. 4:40, carrot, cucumber fucks. Grunts, no movement. Hall stopped him for clarification. Would these have been used separately or together, the carrot and cucumber? Separately, Berdella said. Okay, Hall said. 5:30, he was making some whimpering sounds, Berdella said, looking at the log. 3 cc's of ketamine to the arms. 6:30, front overhead fuck. No reaction. Again, that I tied him down on his back. This continued all the way to 11 a.m. when Berdella left for the flea market. Stoops had just endured nearly 17 hours of continuous hell. When Berdella got home at 3 p.m., he started back in with the sodomies and the injections. Sometimes Stoops would respond to the pain Berdella inflicted as he bit Stoops or bent his fingers backward, but Berdella didn't know if those were conscious reactions or just involuntary reflexes. If Stoops was conscious, he wasn't saying anything, Berdella observed. As Berdella detailed another night of torture, it occurred to Hall that Berdella must have incredible stamina if he was telling the truth. "You're basically going all night," Hall said. "Does this exhaust you also?" "Not on the first night or so," Berdella replied. "If I went into work drowsy, I'd have some caffeine tablets that I would just take part of them, and they gave me enough stimulation to stay awake." One of Berdella's notations was anal bleed, and Berdella said that he noticed blood coming from Stoops' rectum. Berdella moved on down the page and then to the next one and realized he had not mentioned a significant event. "Let me check this," Berdella said, glancing back through the papers he already turned over. "I'm trying to find out which point that I fist-fucked him. We may have missed that. That happened one morning." "We can come back to that later," Hall said. "At the time that I fist-fucked him," Berdella said, "he did not bleed, and then started to bleed rather heavily. The reason Berdella found this significant would soon be revealed." Moving on, Stoops began fighting back when Berdella bit him. So Berdella whipped Stoops with a belt. Hall asked, "What's your purpose in whipping him when he's fighting?" "At this point, I was trying to terrify him," Berdella said, graduating to the level of psychological torture. "Had I not ruptured his anal wall and caused him the severe blood loss that he had, he would have, by further indications, reached a point that he would be much more cooperative. At this point, I wasn't even asking him for that cooperation. I was trying to terrorize him." "You knew at that time," Hall said, "that you had broken his anal wall from the fist fuck?" "That's correct." Still, the sexual assaults continued on Stoops. At 2:50 a.m., Berdella tried his latest experiment, an injection of drain cleaner into the neck or voice box area. "This was something that you learned just from Walter Ferris's Natural Problems," Hall said, "that it would be advantageous to take away a person's voice, or to take away a person's voice, or at least restrict it some, and you were doing that by injecting drain cleaner into the voice box area, yes." Hall noticed that dates Berdella had written on the papers skipped over several days. Berdella said one page appeared to be missing, and there may have been 1 or 2 days when he didn't make notes. "There were probably periods," Berdella said, "where I didn't make notations or keep accurate notations, either because I think at times I didn't think he was going to be able to make it much longer, that I may have just stopped making notes." Hall asked, "During his captivity, did you ever feed him?" Berdella said he gave Stoops some liquids and tried some ice cream and soup, but Stoops wasn't able to keep anything down and wasn't given any solid food. Berdella said he gave Stoops some antibiotics to fight his fever and infection in both pill form and injection, all duly noted as if on a hospital chart. Hall asked Berdella, "Were you trying to monitor these people's reactions as a doctor would monitor someone's reactions in the hospital?" "In a twisted way, probably," Berdella said. On the next page, Berdella related that Stoops asked for a soft drink and a sandwich, but in the sexual encounter minutes earlier, Stoops had resisted, so Berdella denied his request. Stoops began crying. Several hours later, Berdella said he had a discussion on the facts of life with Stoops, talking about what he would have to do to cooperate and not have any more whipping or electricity. Hall said, "You had basically by this time reduced him to a child." "Basically. And he didn't cooperate. You were asking the child, so he had to start crying." "Yes." "Which was your intent to do?" "Yes." The next day, Berdella gave Stoops some chicken soup and soda pop, which Stoops was able to hold down. Hall asked, "As he became more cooperative, you would reward him again?" "Yes." On Stoops' 13th day of captivity, Monday, June 30th, Berdella moved from his bedroom on the second floor up to another room on the third floor. Was there a reason why you were moving him up to the third floor now? Hall asked. Basically, at this point, he was physically pretty deteriorated, Berdella said. You knew that the end was near? Not really, Berdella said. It was just that he, because of his fever, drug withdrawals, whatever, was having problems as far as sleeping and being quiet. It wasn't worth the continued discipline on him to try to make him do something that he couldn't do. I just moved him up to the bedroom on the third floor, and I just kept him up there. Despite Stoops' obvious descent toward death, Berdella still sodomized him that night, though he emphasized there was no penetration, only friction. He also beat Stoops with a belt and administered some brief electric shocks. During what Berdella called a front fuck, he laid out his photographs of Stoops from almost 2 weeks earlier when Stoops was in better physical condition, a strapping young man. Now Stoops' face was drawn and withered, his body shriveled to half its normal proportions. Berdella had even shaved off Stoops' curly hair so that Stoops looked like an inmate at a concentration camp. The next morning, July 1st, Berdella carried Stoops into the bathroom and gave him a bath, both to clean him up and try to reduce his fever. At about 11 a.m., Berdella lifted Stoops out of the tub, dried him off, and helped him back to a chair in the bedroom. He tied a sash around Stoops' chest to secure him to the chair so he could sit up to see if that would help him. Berdella paused, looking down at his notes. I went back to check at 11:30, and he had expired. He was dead. The entry of 86? Hall asked. That's correct. After you gave him a bath, Hall asked, and sat him in the chair to see if that would help him, why did you think placing him in the chair would help him? To give his lungs a chance to drain, Berdella said, or give him a chance to breathe in a sitting position. All of this time with you, Hall continued, under your captivity. When you were injecting him with the drugs, he had a continuous fever, I guess, from the bursting of his anal wall. Yes. At that time when you had him sitting in the chair, did you have him gagged at that point anymore? No, Berdella said. I don't think I used a gag at all when he was up on the third floor. He was in such a state that he couldn't do anything? Hall asked. Basically, yes. Do you have any idea what killed him? I can only guess that he was so weak as to not be able to breathe in a sitting position, Berdella theorized. Do you think it was asphyxiation? Yes, or it could have been the fever, Berdella added. Fever caused by your fist fucking? That's correct. Stoops had been held for nearly 2 weeks, by far the longest captivity, and his death was probably the most gruesome. Berdella recounted taking Stoops' body back to the bathroom, propping him in a sitting position, making cuts in his elbow joints, lower legs, and groin area, and allowing the blood to drain out of the tub. Berdella said he performed the dismemberment over 2 nights, leaving the body in the tub when he went to work or to run errands. He used the same boning knife he had used to cut up previous victims, along with a bow saw and a safety razor. The garbage pickup wasn't for several days, so after wrapping the body parts in paper bags and separate plastic bags, Berdella took the separated corpse downstairs to his basement, where the cooler temperature would slow the decomposition. On Monday morning, July 7th, Berdella set the large bags out by the curb, then watched the bags from his front window until the garbage collectors drove up, just to make sure that they were picked up and that nobody bothered them. Hall asked Berdella about the electric chainsaw police had found, which had pubic hair, blood, and human tissue in it. Who did you use that on? Hall asked. It would have just been Larry Pearson, because he was the only individual in the basement, Berdella said. The other people I used the bow saw on. Back on how? Hall asked. Did you use an electric saw on him? I used an electric chainsaw that I threw out with everything else, Berdella said. The review of Berdella's photo collection came next, with Berdella unemotionally describing each picture. This is where he's been bound at the hands, and then what would be his right leg was in the air, being held by one of the 2 vinyl dog leashes that I used to keep his feet tethered. The next picture. This is of Todd at the period where he was bound face up. It shows on his torso a couple of marks as a result of the belt strap. Berdella had recorded all the gruesome highlights with Stoops, and it was obvious that Berdella was enjoying this and was proud that his memory was so sharp and so exact that each moment was perfectly captured for future enjoyment. And as usual, Berdella picked out the photos that were improperly grouped. Here was one of Larry Pearson. Now came one of Mark Wallace. How are you able to tell that this was Wallace? Hall wondered. His hands, Berdella explained, shape and size of his buttocks, and knowing that it was just a series. One of the other series. When Berdella finally finished with a large stack of photos, Hall asked if anyone else had been in the house during the 2 weeks Stoops was held there. Berdella said no, and no one came into the house or living room to visit or anything, Hall asked. That's correct. All the pictures were taken by you, no one else. That's correct. Did anyone else cooperate in the torture of Todd Stoops? No. Other than attorneys hired by you, have you told anyone up till today the circumstances surrounding the 2 weeks of torture and death of Todd Stoops? No. Day 2 of Berdella's confession was over and still had 1 day remaining. So the final day, there was only one murder left to cover, Larry Pearson. Also, under the agreement reached by both sides, if Berdella had any more killings to discuss, he would confess to them now and not face any stiffer penalty. The irregular intervals between the murders seemed to suggest that Berdella could be holding back, that he had killed some men and left no logs or photos laying around his house. Berdella had killed Hal in 84, then 3 men in 85, but only 1 in 86, and then Pearson in 87, then Bryson, who got away in 88. Did he kill 3 in 1 year, then go back to 1 per year after that? Hall hoped so, and hoped that there was nobody else. Pearson's case was the one with the most unanswered questions. So far, Berdella had kept logs up until the death of his victims, but for his log on Pearson, it ended on July 9th, and Pearson had bitten Berdella on August 5th. Berdella testified in his first guilty plea that he killed Pearson on August 5th. Was Pearson a captive all that time? There were also more photos of Pearson than any other victim, and of course, Berdella had kept Pearson's head. Berdella told Hall he had noticed Pearson walking around downtown in the spring of 1987, and that by chance Pearson stepped into Berdella's shop several weeks later. The two became friends, with Berdella giving Pearson a ride whenever he spotted him walking on the streets. Pearson stayed in Berdella's house occasionally, but the 2 men had no physical involvement then, Berdella said. Looking at his notes, Hall told Berdella that Pearson was arrested for indecent exposure on June 5, 1987. 2 days later, as Berdella was preparing to drive to Ohio to visit his family, Pearson called him from jail and asked Berdella to post his bond. Berdella said he was pleased that Pearson was polite and amiable in his request, and he agreed, so long as Pearson would accompany him to Ohio. When Pearson and Berdella returned to Kansas City several days later, Pearson moved in with Berdella, sleeping on the downstairs couch. Over the next 2 weeks, Berdella said Pearson showed little interest in getting a job or paying rent. This, of course, irritated Berdella, who said Pearson really expected other people to do the responsible work for him. On June 23rd, Berdella and Pearson went to the movies together on Berdella's day off. They saw Creepshow 2, a horror movie, and ate lunch together. At one point while we were driving around, Berdella said, he started telling me how he used to roll queers down in Wichita. He was basically bragging about it, which was kind of an unusual situation. At that point, Berdella decided to capture Pearson. Rolling queers was a term used in the 60s through the 80s that meant the mugging of gay men, easy to roll and take their wallets. And a relationship with Pearson, Hall said, had been, although he was irresponsible, friendly for the most part. Yes. Look, what was it that caused you to form this intent to capture him? Probably the frustration of trying to deal with him not only sexually, but on all other matters, Berdella said. And then when he started doing his little lecture on rolling queers, I quickly formed the opinion, this is somebody that no one's going to end up missing. They aren't going to know where he's at. If you thought back on it, Hall said, focusing on the critical moment, if Mr. Pearson had not brought up this conversation about rolling queers back when he was in Wichita, do you think you would have formed the intent? Or did that just kind of trigger it? I guess that was the trigger, Berdella said. I hadn't been thinking about it for days before or anything. Berdella's log on Pearson started that afternoon. Pearson said he wasn't feeling well, so Berdella crushed some tranquilizers and put them into capsules, telling Pearson they were antibiotics. Pearson swallowed the capsules and headed upstairs to watch television in Berdella's bedroom. A short time later, Pearson returned downstairs. When I saw that the pills were just making him a little drowsy, Berdella said, I challenged him to a shot contest, downing shots of alcohol. Berdella described himself as a light social drinker, just some wine with friends periodically. But on this afternoon, we went through everything, he said. Every partial bottle, peppermint schnapps to vodka. He and I, at that point, had probably consumed 12 to 15 shots. Peace? Hall asked. Yes. Pearson passed out at 6:25 p.m. 10 minutes later, Berdella gave him 3 injections of chlorpromazine, which Pearson barely noticed. After a 4th injection, Berdella clicked off the first photograph of his new captive. Then he went down to the basement and cleared away a spot to hold Pearson. You decided at that time to do this torture or captivity down in the basement, Hall asked. He was not slight, Berdella said. He would have presented a problem as far as trying to drag him up even to the 2nd floor. Of the people that you had held in captives, was he the biggest? Oh, yes. At 7:50 p.m., Berdella wrapped Pearson in a blanket and dragged his limp body down the stairs to the basement. Berdella tied Pearson's hands together over his head, then linked the rope to a chain that was wrapped around a brick column. With that completed, Berdella gave a small injection of drain cleaner to the neck to immobilize Pearson's vocal cords. Then he brought his electric transformer to the basement and shocked Pearson several times just to see what his response would be. Berdella began going line by line through the log, which was inside the same spiral notebook that contained the notes on Bryson. Only with Pearson, the log was 24 pages. Going through this a little bit more rapidly, Hall urged. How long did you keep him down in the basement? Larry was kept in the basement until the following Sunday evening, Berdella said. So it would have been from Tuesday, the 23rd, until the evening of the 28th? Yes, I believe that would be correct. Berdella said Pearson occasionally regained consciousness in the basement and sometimes was cooperative during sex. To ensure Pearson's continued submissiveness, Berdella conducted one of his talks where he told Pearson if he would cooperate, I won't hurt you as much. This young boy, who you had been friendly with, Hall said, what was his reaction when he woke up and discovered that he was chained down in the basement and you were doing this activity to him? Well, first of all, Berdella said, let's not call him a young boy. A young man, please. Pearson was 20. First he made remarks like, stop it, Berdella recalled. At one point later on, I believe, he made some other kind of comment about my mother. Did you talk to him about that? Hall asked. The times that I talked, Berdella said, the attitude I was taking at that time and started taking with Todd Stoops is I would tell him when I wanted to hear from him. Otherwise, he should keep his mouth shut. You explained the rules of the house to him. Yes, or at the point before I would explain the rules, I wouldn't respond to him at all. Berdella brought a mattress down to the basement, where Pearson was lying naked on the cement floor, though Berdella noted, not so much at that point for his comfort, but for mine, as far as when I was laying with him or having sex. On Thursday, Berdella wrote in his log that Pearson said, Can I ask you a question? Berdella answered, No. He explained to Hall, At this point, I wasn't really talking to him so much. I was just completely dominating him. That morning, Pearson yelled for help, and complained that his hands hurt because they were now bound with the piano wire. I told him that he wasn't supposed to make any noise, Berdella said, and gave him 5 shots of electricity and covered his head with a pillowcase. You would have then followed the normal routine that morning of gagging him, having sex with him, and shooting up with drugs before going to work? Hall asked. Yes, Berdella said. Besides the sodomies, Berdella was returning to his role as nurse and doctor and determined on Thursday night that Pearson needed a shot of penicillin to ward off or help him fight any infections, especially in the throat. Berdella was also hitting Pearson intermittently with an iron bar to basically try to break some of his hand bones. And what was your purpose in trying to do that? Hall asked. To incapacitate him, Berdella said. At one point in the first few days, Pearson asked Berdella, "Why was this happening? Is it because I didn't obey you?" Berdella responded by taunting Pearson for his childlike interest in wizards and witchcraft. "This is reality. All this stuff about wizards, etc., is fantasy," he told Pearson, "and you're going to have to deal with this as reality." What was his reaction to that? Hall asked. Cooperation. That afternoon, after work, Berdella gave Pearson a haircut, much as he had done with Robert Sheldon and Todd Stoops, because their long hair was getting tangled in the bindings. Berdella also shaved Pearson's face and gave him some soda pop and sugar water, all as rewards for Pearson's cooperative nature. Still, Berdella held another attitude class, telling Pearson that he would be completely cooperative and submissive, that he wasn't supposed to talk unless I was there with him and told him okay and gave him permission. No screaming. As far as if I was up on the first floor, I would be down to check on him, and he would not call up to me to have me come down. And he apparently became very cooperative after that explanation, Hall asked. That's correct. Of all the people that you held captive, Hall said, was Pearson the most cooperative? Yes, Berdella said, then added, I think as we discussed with Stoops yesterday, that had he not had a serious blood loss, he would have come around to be fully cooperative. And this goes on until August 5th. I think you've testified in court, Hall said. The fact that he lasted so long, over almost a month and a half, was that due to his cooperation with you? Yes, Berdella said. He went on to explain that he had Pearson so completely under control that when he moved Pearson upstairs to his bed, he had trained himself to sleep the entire night without moving, so as not to bother Berdella. One night Pearson asked Berdella, How long am I going to be your sex slave? Berdella told him, Don't ask. After that, Pearson began calling Berdella Master Bob. On Sunday, June 28th, Berdella affixed a dog collar and leash to Pearson, and walked the naked hostage up to the second floor. Berdella said Pearson was fully cooperative in the move and in an attempt to escape, in part because his hands were badly swollen from the beatings and the piano wire that had been tied around his wrists. However, I probably had a wood stick, a tree limb in my hand in case he tried anything. From then on, any time Pearson wanted to leave the bedroom, even to use the bathroom, Berdella controlled him with a leash. When Berdella left the house, the leash would have been tethered on to the bed, and his legs would have been spread and tied to the foot of the bed. Hall asked about a notation in the log. Kept disturbing. Berdella said one of the things I was teaching him was if I was, there with him and watching TV, I didn't want to be disturbed. I explained to him that if he created a problem, that I would just as soon move him back to the basement, that he would either behave himself or go back to the basement. He didn't want to go back to the basement. When Pearson kept disturbing, Berdella said, I informed him that he was going to get a couple of shots of electricity. Tied his legs. He put the gag in and not tying his arms in any fashion. He fully cooperated while I gave him 3 shots of electricity. Do you recall where you gave those shots to him? Hall asked. I think it was the shoulder to the leg, Berdella said, referring to the 2 locations where he attached the wires to Pearson's body. There would be a photo of that somewhere, Berdella added. During an anal sodomy at 2 a.m. that night, Pearson made the comment that he was going to die. According to Berdella's log, Berdella explained that Pearson was saying things like, This not because he felt he was going to die or anything. He thought the comments would add pleasure to me while he was having sex with me. He acknowledged basically that I was dominating him. He was finding ways, I assume, from some of his previous hustling or improvising, to try to find any way to please me. He knew that when he pleased me, especially without being told to, that I would reward him with something. The next morning, Berdella rewarded Pearson with solid food for the first time, cooking him a breakfast of eggs, toast, and sausage. But always he was returned to the bed, sodomized, and then tied down. Did he realize the reality of what was going on? What you were doing to him? Hall asked. I think there was never any doubt after maybe the first or second day of what situation he was in, Berdella said. He had been plainly informed that he was being kept as a love slave, a sex slave. And telling him the situation he was in, Hall asked, did you give him any indication how long the situation was going to last, or any relief from the situation? That would have never been discussed, Berdella said. He would have taken it for granted that I would not allow him to escape or release him. Was there ever any discussion, Hall said, about, can I ever get out of this, or did he just assume this was it till death? I don't know if he assumed to death, Berdella said. I just figured he knew he was not going anywhere, and cooperating made it a lot easier on him. The example that I would have given him, like when we were having sex at one time and his arms were hurting, I asked him to compare the pain in his arms to what electricity felt like, and letting him compare, you can either accept the pain in your arms, or you can get some electricity. Which level of pain do you want to deal with? Obviously, he'd stick with just his arms. Scanning his log slightly faster, Berdella noted that July 8th was the first time I allowed him to perform oral sex on me. Cooperated. No hassle. Next notation is 7 to 9 a.m. Again, oral sex. No hassle. And I think my notation is that while this was going on, Ollie North was on. While he was orally copulating you? Hall asked. Yes, Berdella said. This would not have been a planned event. We just had the TV on, and apparently something about Ollie North came on. Berdella's note-taking began to be less detailed, and on most days he didn't keep any notes at all. Several pages in the log tracked the amounts of antibiotics that Berdella had given Pearson, and one page noted the color of his urine and the quality of his voice. Did his voice get worse, Hall asked, or did it get better? After the swelling had gone down, he had a coarse but understandable voice, Berdella said. Between July 9th and July 26th, Hall said. Was it just a daily routine? Pretty much so. Did you have to use any type of torture to get him to submit to you? Never. Were you using, for instance, the electrocution during that time period of July? Not at all. So he had completely submitted to you. That's correct. From July 26th until August 5th, Hall asked, were you having to use any torture? No. You would go to work? The routine would be, Berdella began, I'd wake up in the morning, have sex with him, prepare breakfast for the both of us, feed him, tie him down while I went to work or ran any errands that I might have ran, gotten back from work, came up, untied him, gave him a couple of cigarettes to smoke, and I would always bring a cold drink up from the kitchen when I first came up and allowed him to drink that while I prepared supper or made my phone calls or fed the dogs or whatever else I had to do. Then I would usually go up and spend the rest of the evening with him, unless I had some meeting or errands that I had to run. He would be very cooperative. He'd allow me to tie him back down. After 5 practice victims, Berdella had perfected his method for utter physical satisfaction. Total domination at all times, sex in any variation whenever he wanted it. A defeated, compliant captive. Pearson not only had no hope for escape, he had no desire. And to recreate the situation with another young man, Berdella needed only to consult his extensive case log, all neatly kept in one spiral notebook along with his photographic documentation. Let's go over what happened on August 5th, Hall said. When I had come up and untied Larry, Berdella recalled, with the exception of the dog collar and leash, I gave him a Coke and cigarettes while I took care of the phone calls, etc. When I finally went in to spend some time with him, in the mail I had gotten an advertisement for men's clothing or something. Basically, I think it was from IM or International Mail. It would usually show a lot of beefcake and then a swimsuit or something that went with it. Berdella paused. I had him perform oral sex on me while I was looking at this magazine. What ended up happening was he then bit me on the penis severely. He was not tethered to anything when he was doing the oral sex. I usually would just hold the leash in my hand. He bit me. I finally got up off the bed. He was standing in front of me with some blood dripping out of his mouth. My penis was bleeding at that point rather profusely. I grabbed a rag and held it to my penis while I talked to him, and after about 5 or 10 minutes of explaining to him this is not the way to handle this... After he bit your penis, Hall interrupted, did he say anything to you? He was yelling something basically about... I really don't have a coherent memory of it. Discussing something about how he wasn't going to be treated this way. Probably at that time I thought that he was talking about being held captive because he made no effort to escape. He allowed me to tie him back down. I think this is the first time I had used anything like a magazine for that and wasn't giving the direct attention to him. I think more than anything else, he bit me because he wanted attention. Berdella went to Menorah Medical Center, to the ER. The first doctor that came in and looked at me gave me, I think, Demerol or something for pain. And then a little later, another internist or somebody came in and talked to me and explained that they were going to have to keep me for a couple of days. At that point, I explained that I had a dog at home, a female dog with pups, and I was going to have to find some way of getting home to let her in. Berdella stopped, realizing he'd forgotten part of his narrative. I guess I'm leaving out one part, he said. He remembered that after tying Pearson to the bed and injecting him with 10 cc's of acepromazine, he went to the bathroom to wash up. When he returned, he picked up a stick and told Pearson, "Now you're going to feel what it's like," and started hitting him with the stick. One of the blows hit Pearson on the back of the head, and that blow just knocked him out, Berdella said. That was basically the condition that I had left him in when I went to the hospital. When I found out I was going to have to spend a couple days there, I did have to get home to bring the dog in. When I got home, I brought the dog in to her pups, made sure she had plenty of food and water to last a couple of days, went upstairs to check on Pearson. He was completely passed out because of the events or the blow to the head or both. But still alive? Hall asked. Still alive, Berdella confirmed, trying to decide what to do with him, looking at my own condition, and saw that between the blows to the ribs, which were now very heavy red marks, and his jaw and face, that I put a plastic bag over his head and killed him. You got up to the bedroom, Hall said, and looked at his body, but determined that he was now useless to you? I guess the quick evaluation that I did was, Berdella said, the condition that I was in, not knowing how long it would take to heal, etc. How long you might be in the hospital. Being in the hospital, and how long it would take for my penis to heal, Berdella said, period. And seeing that I probably had hurt him as far as the ribs and skull and chin, possibly severely, that it would, coming back from the hospital and being able to take care of myself and try to heal him, just wouldn't be a possibility. That it was better for both of us, and I just put him to sleep, realizing that you were killing him. Yes. You then went back down and got a trash bag, Hall asked. Or was a trash bag up there? I'm not sure, Berdella said. Just got a trash bag, put it over his head, and secured it with a sash. Did the other things I had to do. What were the other things? Basically, I fed the dogs and etc., making sure she had water and food, and the doors downstairs, the rest of the house would be shut so that she couldn't get in there, and went up, checked on him, and he was at that point dead. And what did you check to see that he was dead? To see whether he was still breathing, Berdella said. At this point, the plastic bag, which had been kind of bubbly, was now sucked out of all air and was very tight around his face. Locked up the house, and the way Menorah had sent me to my house was in a taxi cab because they didn't want me to drive myself, and I just got back in the cab, went to the hospital, and they operated on me. Hall backed up. When you went back to Menorah, I take it the cab was there. Was all this activity within minutes? Well, the cab was outside waiting, and when you went back to Menorah, Hall said, you just left his body lying there. Yes, Berdella said, I left the air conditioner on, closed the other doors so that room would stay cool enough or so that he wouldn't rot. There is a picture of, I believe, Mr. Pearson with a sack over his face, Hall said. I believe 2 or possibly 3 pictures, Berdella corrected. Were those all taken before you left to go back to Menorah? That's correct. You then went back to Menorah and were operated on. And then how long did you remain at Menorah? I got home Friday afternoon around 2 or 3. You apparently killed him on Wednesday, August the 5th. That's correct. Berdella returned home 2 days later wearing a catheter. He dragged Pearson's body to the basement and started the dismemberment the next day. But this time, instead of working on a long-term basis, because I was too weak and painful to do that, I would go down and do one process at a time, like opening the stomach and pulling out all the internal parts, then go down later and start cutting him up, and I'd go down and start packing. This was over the course of about 2 days. There was never any hoisting him up onto the beam, Hall asked. No. What tools did you use for that process? Hall asked. Basically, the same safety razor, boning knife, Berdella said. Because of my condition, I relied on the chainsaw a lot more. I would cut down to the bone and the meat, the muscle and skin would fall apart, and just use the chainsaw to cut it apart as opposed to the bone saw. At this point, Hall said, you make a determination to save Mr. Pearson's head. That's correct. And I take it the dismembering process took Saturday into Sunday, and then you put the rest of his body out for the trash on Monday. That's correct. All the same process except for the head of Pearson, Berdella said, finishing the sentence. Initially, I just put it in a plastic trash bag and set it in the freezer. That freezer on your back porch? Hall asked. Right. Before doing that, or at any time before burying the head, did you take the skin off the skull? No. You did leave the vertebrae attached to the skull. I didn't make any attempt to remove it, no. And how long did the head remain then in the freezer? Hall asked. Probably for a week or so until I was in better condition, Berdella answered. You would have buried it then, probably the following weekend, you think? Something like that, yeah, Berdella said. I didn't want to keep something like that in the house or somebody might stumble upon it. Did you have a purpose in saving Mr. Pearson's skull? Not a logical one, Berdella said, and not one that I can even recognize or put into words myself. I don't understand myself why I kept the 2 skulls. You did desire, though, to keep the skulls, apparently. Yes. And a week or approximately later, Hall said, you took the skull into the backyard to bury it. Right. Now I think when we discussed Sheldon, Hall recalled, you told us that you didn't take the Sheldon skull out until after you put the Pearson skull simultaneously. Yes, Berdella said, nodding. Was it buried in the same place as the Sheldon skull? That's correct. Hall pulled out a photo, handed it to Berdella, and asked him to identify it. This is a section of my yard, Berdella said, boarded off around the edges and usually used as a vegetable patch for something like beans that I hadn't used this year, and what would be the corner closest to me is the corner where I kept the skulls buried, one at a time. Were those boards up there prior to burying of the Sheldon skull back in '85, Hall asked. For several years, yes, Berdella said, adding that he put the boards there to keep weeds from growing into the patch. Then when you buried the Pearson skull and took out the Sheldon skull, Hall said, would that have been at night time? Probably late afternoon or early evening, Berdella said, just as it had started to cool and darken. It didn't create any security problem, Hall asked, as far as somebody being able to see that you're doing it. That's correct. And you certainly would have made every effort to make sure that no one... That's correct. I think that officers found, Hall said, correct me if I'm wrong, some type of rag or cloth material. Yes, Berdella said, that would have been when I buried the Pearson skull. The gag and that was still around his mouth and neck. Berdella said he took Sheldon's skull inside, along with the loose vertebrae, and soaked them in a bucket of water, After the skull was washed and cleaned, he removed the teeth with a pair of pliers and placed them in 2 separate envelopes, one for the upper jaw and one for the lower jaw. He then put the skull and teeth in a closet in my gallery area, where it stayed until police found it 8 months later. For the final time, Hall turned to a stack of pictures of a Berdella victim and asked him to identify them. This stack was the largest. Berdella asked, if I may, if it meets with your approval for the expediency of identifying here. There were a lot of pictures. If we could break it down as far as photographs before capture and when first moved to the basement, 2nd floor while still being disciplined, and 2nd floor while he cooperated. Fine, Hall said. So Berdella categorized his torture photos and then proceeded to footnote many of the photos, such as the next picture is him sitting up as he was smoking. It would have been the 2nd floor when he was fully cooperative. The next picture shows him sitting on the side of the bed, tethered with a leash and dog collar. This was when he first came up to the 2nd floor. The next picture shows Larry Pearson, 2nd floor, during the period he is still being disciplined, and he receives the electricity shock. The photos took nearly half an hour to dig through. When Berdella was done, Hall remembered he had something else to ask about the sequence of events. The police report Berdella made at the hospital after being bitten. Was it your intention to make the report? Hall asked. Did you ask the officer to make the report? Yes, I did. What was your purpose for doing that? I, unlike the police report said, did try to file a charge against Larry Pearson, Berdella said, therefore diverting any, giving me at least an alibi why Larry wasn't hanging around anymore. The officer that took the report, I believe, was out there first to handle a gunshot wound. When he came into the room and he found the nature of my condition and the nature of the complaint, he tried to handle it as quickly as possible, behaving like he really didn't want to make this report in the first place. So you were at that point, Hall said, trying to establish an alibi, knowing that what you had done or were doing was wrong and against the law? That's correct. Hall asked Berdella about the large trash containers in which police had found traces of blood when they were sprayed with luminol. Berdella asked, does that just respond to human blood or blood of any kind? Any kind. Then there was a lot of blood in various places in my house, Berdella said, noting that he purchased cheap meats in bulk from veal to tenderloin either for his own use or to distribute to neighbors and friends. He said he used the containers to store the raw meat and hadn't stored any human blood there. A photo of the robe over Berdella's head was handed to Berdella, who quickly described it as a common native or coat shirt from the Afghanistan area. Did that robe in any way have anything to do with the occult or Satanism? Hall asked. No, Berdella said, strictly used as decoration or ornamentation. Okay, Hall said, other than the 6 individuals that we've gone over, from Howe through Pearson, were there any other individuals that you murdered in your house? No, Berdella said. Are there any other individuals where the crime started in Jackson County and they were murdered in another county? Hall asked. No. Prior to March of 1988, Hall said, were there any other individuals that you held captive but lived, made it out of your house? No. Hall handed Berdella what appeared to be the last unexplained torture log. Do you recognize that, sir? Hall asked. Berdella looked at it for several seconds, then realized what it was. This is when I first started getting some of the ace-promazine, particularly the Thorazine was the first one I got my hands on. I don't remember what year. I didn't know what dosage to use on my dogs. I found a stray running loose one day, a large black dog, took it down to the basement and ran an experiment with chlorpromazine on it to see how much it really took to do a dog. So, Exhibit 19 has nothing to do with injections into a human being, Hall said. That's correct. Looking at the log, Hall asked, in your 1048 entry, what are those words? Slowing and drowsy, referring to the dog? Yes. Then at 10:45 with the notation down, which meant he probably would have laid down, Berdella then read line by line down the log, explaining the same matter-of-fact style as he did with his human victims, how he injected and experimented on a stray dog. Next, Hall handed Berdella his photos of men who were still alive, One by one, he identified each of the men. Some of them had been injected with various tranquilizers, and in some cases, Berdella admitted that he had used for sexual relief, meaning he had rubbed against the man after he was passed out, but he hadn't tried to capture any of these people for various reasons. For one of the men, Berdella said, he started to keep a log which was never found. The photos of the man were taken in 1986. Berdella said, and Hall asked him, in 86, this would have been after most of the individuals we've discussed, the 6 individuals. If he was totally immobilized, why did you choose not to capture him? At that point, I had no desire or need to, Berdella said, adding that many people would come to my house, use drugs, and leave. Hall pointed out individual police photographs of Berdella's house. Hall asked him about a pair of antlers found on the stairwell, and Berdella said he usually kept them in the second-floor bathroom, holding a roll of toilet paper. There is nothing of any occult or satanic significance about the antlers, Hall asked. No. Hall asked about the Black Mass album that was found on the turntable on the 3rd floor. Berdella said he once knew a young woman who ran the record department at a Main Street drugstore, and she provided him with 3 stacks of promotional copies of albums. These would not have been albums that, on occasion, I would have bought, Berdella said, pointing to the Black Mass LP. Turning from the photos to some of the rumors and reports police had turned up, Hall asked Berdella if he had ever performed an exorcism of a devil from a child. At that time, the satanic panic was laughable. Hall asked Berdella if he had ever performed an exorcism of a devil from a child. Berdella was amused, smiled slightly, and said, No, I have never exorcised anybody. I don't even like aerobics. The attempted pun did not draw a laugh with the people in the same room. However, I really think that's a pretty darn good pun. So, good job. Did you ever invite anyone to join a coven? No, Berdella said, shaking his head. Did you see the Geraldo Rivera show? Hall asked. Berdella said his attorneys had brought a tape of the show to him and showed him the segment on his alleged cult involvement. Hall asked about the woman who claimed Berdella was a high priest and who witnessed a human sacrifice to Berdella. So, you know darn well that person was just trying to get her 5 minutes of fame. Anyway, Berdella said, I have no idea who that person was or why they would be saying this. What she said, Hall asked, is it in any way true? No, Berdella said. Hall brought out more photos, this time of items that possibly had satanic significance. Berdella explained the origins of each one and denied that any of them were part of a ritual process. Hall brought out some more photos, this time of items that possibly had satanic significance. Berdella explained the origins of each one and denied that any of them were part of a ritual process. Hall moved to the rumors of Berdella's burial of bodies at the farm south of the city. Did you ever dispose of any bodies at the farm? Hall asked. None. Did you ever commit any murders on the farms? Neither on the farms or any farms in Jackson County, Cass County, or anywhere in the United States, Berdella said. Hall asked about the report that Berdella had taken heavy trash bags to one of the farms. Berdella said the one time he did that, the bags contained a lot of daylilies, along with, I think, some raspberry bushes that had grown wild in my backyard, and that he took them to one of the farm owners to replant. Hall touched on numerous other, more outlandish rumors and speculations. Berdella refuted all of them. Hall asked if Berdella's contributions to the flea market's potluck lunches, if he used any human meat. None whatsoever, Berdella said, nor did I use bones from human bodies to cut into bone meats. Did you ever feed the dogs? Hall asked. The chow puppies or the chow dogs, parts of human bodies? No, Berdella said. Prior to March of 1988, Hall asked, was there anyone that you tried to capture or intended to capture but were unable to do so? I made an attempt on Lamar Rich, Berdella said, in regards to giving him some crystal meth that I told him was speed. It was, in fact, dried-out ketamine, and while what I gave him was enough to kind of knock him to his knees for a minute, It wasn't anywhere near enough, apparently, to knock him out. With each victim, Hall asked, "Were you able to conform your conduct to the requirements of law? Were you able to not do it, but made a conscious choice to do it?" "That's correct," Berdella responded each time. Hall followed with a series of questions about whether Berdella understood what he was doing by pleading guilty and waiving a trial. Berdella said he did. Hall asked if there is anything that you wish to clarify, any answers you wish to change, or any other statement that you wish to make before we stop this questioning. "No. Not at this time, no," Berdella said. Hall looked up at the clock and declared, "The time is now 3:58 on Thursday afternoon, December the 15th, and this completes the statement." And that, by far, is the longest thing I will ever do. Ever again. I will look in advance, for sure, to see how long things are. Oh my gosh, I'm glad this is over. Have a good evening.